November 23rd, 2024. Kodiak bear kills two hunters in their sleep. November 23rd, 2024. Kodiak bear kills two hunters in their sleep. The morning fog hung thick over Karluk Lake as Alaska State Trooper Dennis Morrison received the distress call that would haunt him for the rest of his career. At 6:47 a.m., a crackling satellite phone transmission cut through the static of his radio, the voice on the other end barely coherent through panic and grief. This is Guide Service Alpha 7. We need immediate evacuation. Two hunters are dead. Jesus Christ, they're dead. The bear it came right through the tent. Morrison had been working search and rescue operations on Kodiak Island for 12 years, had seen drownings, hypothermia cases, hunters lost in the maze of alder thickets that covered the island's interior, but nothing had prepared him for what he would find at GPS coordinates 57.2431 degrees north, 154.0869 degrees west, deep in the Kodiak National Wildlife Refuge. The brothers Ethan Michael Walker, 34, and Sean Patrick Walker, 29, both from Bozeman, Montana, lay in the shredded remains of their REI quarter-dome tent, their planned 10-day brown bear hunting expedition having ended in the worst possible way just 4 days in. The Walker brothers had arrived in Kodiak on November 19th, aboard Alaska Airlines Flight 64 from Seattle. Their connecting flight delayed 3 hours due to the late autumn storms that regularly battered the Gulf of Alaska. Ethan, the elder brother, was a civil engineer for the Montana Department of Transportation, a methodical man who approached hunting with the same precision he brought to bridge construction. His hunting journal, later recovered from the campsite, detailed every aspect of their preparation with engineering thoroughness. Wind patterns, temperature fluctuations, bear movement corridors identified through months of studying topographical maps and consultation with local guides. Sean, by contrast, was the adventurer of the pair, a freelance wilderness photographer whose Instagram account at Sean Captures Wild had gained modest fame for his stunning images of North American wildlife. Where Ethan planned, Sean adapted. Where Ethan calculated risks, Sean embraced them. It was Sean who had proposed the Kodiak hunt, Sean who had convinced his more cautious older brother that they could handle the challenge of hunting the largest brown bears in the world without a guide, despite neither having hunted brown bears before. Their guide, Marcus Bear Thompson, a 47-year-old Alaska native who had been guiding hunters on Kodiak for 23 years, had recommended against the brothers going unguided into the interior of the island. Thompson, whose weather-beaten face bore the scars of a close encounter with a sow grizzly in 1998, had offered them his services for $8,000. Kodiak ain't like hunting blackies in Montana, he had warned them over coffee at Henry's Great Alaskan Restaurant on their first night in town. These brown bears, they're different, smarter, more aggressive, and this time of year, right before denning, they're desperate for calories. Ethan had politely declined Thompson's services, explaining that they were experienced hunters who had taken elk, moose, and black bears across the American West. They had quality equipment, proper permits, and had studied the area extensively. What they didn't understand, what Thompson had tried unsuccessfully to convey, was that Kodiak Island existed in a category entirely its own when it came to brown bear hunting. Kodiak Island, roughly the size of Connecticut, supports the densest population of brown bears in the world. The Kodiak brown bear, Ursus arctos middendorfi, is the largest subspecies of brown bear, with adult males averaging 8 to 10 feet in length and weighing between 660 to 1,320 pounds. The island's unique ecosystem, rich with salmon runs and abundant vegetation, has created the perfect environment for these massive predators to thrive. What makes Kodiak bears particularly dangerous to humans is not just their size, but their behavior. Unlike interior Alaska grizzlies or coastal brown bears in other regions, Kodiak bears have evolved with minimal human contact and therefore lack the instinctual wariness that keeps most bear encounters from turning fatal. The Walker brothers had secured their permits through the Alaska Department of Fish and Game lottery system, a process that typically takes years of applications to successfully draw. Sean had been applying for 7 consecutive years before finally receiving the coveted Kodiak brown bear tag. The permit allowed for 1 bear per hunter during a 10-day window in November, traditionally one of the most challenging times to hunt on the island due to deteriorating weather conditions and the bears' preparation for winter denning. Their charter flight from Kodiak to Karluk Lake had been arranged through Kodiak Air Service, piloted by Captain Jake Hendricks, a former Air Force pilot who'd been flying hunters and fishermen around the Kodiak archipelago for 15 years. Hendricks remembered the Walker brothers clearly when interviewed later by Alaska state troopers. They seemed well prepared, he recalled. Good equipment, physical fitness looked solid. The younger one, Sean, was excited, asking lots of questions about bear behavior, best hunting areas. The older brother was quieter, more focused on logistics. They had quality rifles, good optics. Nothing about them suggested they were unprepared. The flight to Karluk Lake took 43 minutes in Hendricks' Cessna 206, the small aircraft buffeted by crosswinds as they flew over the island's mountainous interior. From the air, Kodiak Island appeared as a vast wilderness of tundra and forest, dotted with hundreds of lakes and crossed by salmon-rich streams. The terrain was deceptively beautiful, rolling hills covered in autumn-brown grass and scattered stands of Sitka spruce. What wasn't visible from the air was the density of the alder thickets that covered much of the lowlands, creating maze-like corridors where visibility was limited to a few yards and the sound of approaching wildlife was muffled by the thick vegetation. Hendricks had landed on Karluk Lake at 2:17 p.m. on November 19th. The float plane touching down on the lake's choppy surface with practiced precision. The brothers unloaded their gear quickly, aware that daylight was precious this far north in late November. Their equipment list, meticulously recorded in Ethan's journal, included 2 Weatherby Mark V rifles chambered in .375H and H Magnum Leupold 5X5 HD scopes, a combination of Nosler partition and Barnes TSX ammunition specifically chosen for large game, a 4-season mountaineering tent rated for extreme weather, sleeping systems rated to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and enough food for 12 days. "I'll be back on the 29th, Hendricks had called out as he prepared for takeoff. "Same time, same spot, weather permitting." The brothers had waved from the shore as the Cessna lifted off, its engine noise quickly fading into the vast silence of the Kodiak wilderness. They were now entirely on their own, 10 miles from the nearest human habitation in the heart of the world's most concentrated brown bear population. The first 2 days of their hunt had proceeded without incident. Ethan's journal entries, written in his characteristic precise handwriting, detailed their movements and observations. November 19th. Established base camp, 200 yards from lake shore, good water access, elevated position with clear sight lines. No bear sign immediately visible. Temperature dropping rapidly after sunset. Wind from northwest at 15 to 20 miles per hour. November 20th. First full hunting day. Observed bear tracks along creek approximately 1.2 miles southeast of camp. Large tracks, estimate 800+ pound male. Did not encounter bear. Sean photographed extensive fish remains, suggesting active feeding area, weather holding, clear skies. It was during their 3rd day, November 21st, that the brothers first encountered the bear that would ultimately kill them. Sean's camera, a high-end Canon EOS R5 with a 100 to 400 millimeter lens, captured the animal in a series of photographs that would later be analyzed by wildlife biologists and featured prominently in news coverage of the attack. The images showed a massive male brown bear estimated by Alaska Department of Fish and Game biologist Dr. Sarah Chen to weigh approximately 1,100 pounds, feeding on the carcass of a salmon in a creek roughly half a mile from their campsite. "That's him," Sean had whispered to his brother, both men lying prone behind a fallen log, observing the bear through binoculars. "That's our bear." The animal was magnificent and terrifying, its chocolate-brown fur thick with winter growth, its massive head and shoulder hump creating an imposing silhouette against the grey November sky. Through their optics, they could see the bear's methodical feeding behavior, the way it periodically raised its head to scan for threats, its small eyes and rounded ears in constant motion. Ethan, ever cautious, had wanted to take the shot immediately. They were approximately 150 yards from the bear, well within the effective range of their rifles, with a clear shooting lane and favorable wind direction. But Sean convinced his brother to wait, arguing that they should observe the animal's behavior patterns, learn its routine, and make a more strategic approach. "We've got time," Sean had argued. "Let's make sure we do this right." This decision to wait, to observe rather than act, would prove to be fatal. The bear they were watching was not a typical Kodiak brown bear. Post-attack investigation by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, led by bear biologist Dr. Chen and wildlife trooper Captain Bob McGrath, would reveal that the animal had several characteristics that made it particularly dangerous to humans. First, it was a large, solitary male in its prime, estimated to be between 8 and 12 years old based on track measurements and photographic analysis. Second, it showed no instinctual fear of humans, suggesting it had either never encountered humans before or had experienced previous encounters where it was not deterred by human presence. Most significantly, the bear's behavior pattern suggested it was actively hunting, not just opportunistically feeding. Dr. Chen's analysis of the scene would later conclude that the bear had been aware of the Walker brothers' presence from their first day in the area and had been systematically observing their routines and movement patterns. This wasn't a chance encounter or a defensive reaction by a surprised bear, Dr. Chen would later testify at the coroner's inquest. The physical evidence suggests this bear made a deliberate decision to attack the humans in their tent. This represents extremely unusual behavior for Kodiak brown bears. On the evening of November 21st, the brothers returned to their camp as darkness fell, having spent nearly 8 hours observing the bear from various positions. Sean's photographs from that day showed the animal in different locations along the creek system, confirming that it was actively patrolling a territory that included their camping area. Ethan's journal entry for that evening noted, "Bear observed at 4 separate locations throughout the day. Animal appears to be following established patrol route. Feeding heavily on salmon remains. No indication bear aware of our presence. Plan to attempt harvest tomorrow morning during first feeding cycle." What Ethan couldn't know, what no human observer could have detected without sophisticated tracking equipment, was that the bear had been aware of their presence from the moment they established camp. Brown bears possess sensory capabilities far beyond human comprehension. Their sense of smell is approximately 7 times stronger than a bloodhound's, capable of detecting odors from miles away. Their hearing is similarly acute, able to detect sounds at frequencies and volumes that humans cannot perceive. The bear had been tracking the brothers' movements, learning their routines, and evaluating them not as a threat to be avoided, but as potential prey to be hunted. November 22nd dawned grey and cold, with temperatures dropping to 18 degrees Fahrenheit and a steady northwest wind that cut through even the best outdoor clothing. The brothers rose before dawn, consumed a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee, and prepared for what they expected to be their final hunt. Their plan, detailed in Ethan's journal, was to approach the bear's feeding area before sunrise, establish shooting positions at approximately 120 yards, and wait for the animal to appear for its morning feeding routine. They never made it to their planned shooting positions. At approximately 5:30 a.m., as the brothers were leaving their campsite in the pre-dawn darkness, they encountered fresh bear tracks in the thin layer of snow that had fallen during the night. The tracks were massive, easily recognizable as belonging to the bear they had been observing, and they led directly from the creek area to within 50 yards of their tent before circling the campsite and returning toward the creek. "He was here," Ethan whispered, kneeling beside the clearest track and comparing it to the photographs in his smartphone. "He was watching us." The implications of this discovery were immediately clear to both brothers. The bear hadn't simply been feeding in the area. It had made a deliberate reconnaissance of their campsite during the night. For the first time since arriving on Kodiak Island, both brothers felt genuine fear. They had hunted dangerous game before, had faced charging elk and territorial moose, but this was different. This bear was hunting them as methodically as they had been hunting it. Sean's hands shook slightly as he photographed the tracks, the camera's flash illuminating the perfect impressions in the snow. Each track measured nearly 14 inches in length, with claw marks extending an additional 4 inches beyond the toe pads. The decision they made next would be debated extensively in the subsequent investigation. Rather than immediately breaking camp and moving to a new location or aborting the hunt entirely and activating their satellite emergency beacon to request early extraction, the brothers decided to continue with their hunting plan but with modified tactics. They would hunt the bear that morning as planned, but they would do so with heightened awareness and with one brother always maintaining overwatch while the other took the shot. "We're here to hunt," Sean argued when Ethan suggested they consider leaving. "We've put too much time and money into this to be scared off by some tracks. We'll be extra careful, but we're not backing down." Ethan, despite his growing unease, agreed. They had invested over $15,000 in the hunt, including permits, flights, equipment, and time off work. More importantly, they had dreamed of this hunt for years. A Kodiak brown bear was the ultimate trophy for North American hunters, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that might never come again. They modified their approach route to avoid the areas where the tracks indicated the bear had been moving, taking a wider circuit through more open terrain where they would have better visibility. Their movement was slow and methodical, both brothers constantly scanning for any sign of the bear. They reached their planned observation point at 6:45 a.m., just as the first grey light of dawn began to illuminate the landscape. The bear was already there, waiting for them. Later investigation would determine that the animal had positioned itself in a cluster of older trees, approximately 80 yards from where the brothers established their shooting position. It had been watching them approach, had allowed them to settle into what they believed was a concealed position, and had then begun a careful stalk that demonstrated intelligence and hunting behavior that wildlife biologists had never before documented in brown bears. Sean spotted the movement first, a subtle shift in the shadows that caught his attention as he scanned the area through his rifle scope. "Movement at 2 o'clock, he whispered to Ethan, who immediately swung his binoculars toward the indicated direction. What they saw challenged everything they thought they knew about bear behavior. The massive brown bear was moving through the alder thicket with deliberate stealth, using the terrain and vegetation for concealment in a manner more typical of a hunting predator than a normally wary omnivore. Its movements were calculated and purposeful, each step carefully placed to minimize sound and maintain visual cover. Most unnervingly, the bear's attention was not focused on the creek and its salmon remains, but was directed specifically toward the location where the brothers had positioned themselves. "It knows we're here," Ethan whispered, his voice tight with tension. "It's stalking us." Through their optics, they could see the bear's eyes, small and dark, focused intently in their direction. The animal's body language displayed none of the nervous energy typical of a bear that had detected human presence. Instead, it moved with the confident purposefulness of an apex predator that had identified its target and was closing for the kill. The brothers had two choices: take an immediate shot at a range of approximately 80 yards through moderately dense vegetation, or attempt to withdraw from their position and re-establish somewhere with better shooting conditions. Sean, his adrenaline spiking, favored the immediate shot. "I can take him," he whispered, settling his rifle into a solid shooting position. Clear shot through the scope. Ethan, however, was calculating angles and distances with the precision that had made him successful as an engineer. The shot, while possible, was far from ideal. The bear was partially concealed by vegetation. The angle was quartering away rather than the preferred broadside presentation, and their position was not as stable as he would have preferred for such a critical shot. "Wait," he instructed his brother. "Let's see if he gives us a better opportunity." That decision, reasonable and consistent with ethical hunting practices, cost them their lives. The bear continued its approach, moving with increasing boldness as it closed the distance between itself and the hunters. At 60 yards, it emerged from the thickest part of the alder thicket into a small clearing, presenting the brothers with the broadside shot they had been hoping for. Both men immediately recognized the opportunity. Sean settled behind his rifle, his breathing controlled, his crosshairs steady on the bear's vitals. But as Sean's finger moved to the trigger, the bear did something that no brown bear in documented hunting history had ever been observed doing. It charged not in response to a perceived threat, but as a premeditated hunting attack. The distance between the bear and the hunters closed with shocking speed. Brown bears, despite their massive size, are capable of reaching speeds of up to 35 miles per hour, faster than any human can run. The brothers had approximately 4 seconds from the moment the bear began its charge until it reached their position. Sean's first shot, fired in haste as the enormous animal closed the distance, struck the bear in the shoulder, but failed to penetrate deeply enough to reach vital organs. The 300-grain Nosler partition bullet, designed specifically for large, dangerous game, was deflected by the bear's massive shoulder blade and dense muscle mass. The impact staggered the animal momentarily, but did not stop its charge. Ethan's shot, fired a fraction of a second later, was more accurate, striking the bear center chest, but the animal's momentum carried it forward even as the bullet tore through its lungs. In the time it took both brothers to cycle their bolt-action rifles for follow-up shots, the wounded bear covered the remaining distance between them. What happened next lasted less than 30 seconds, but would be reconstructed in horrifying detail through analysis of the physical evidence, the brothers' equipment, and Sean's camera, which continued photographing automatically until it was destroyed in the attack. The bear struck Sean first, its massive paw swinging in a horizontal arc that caught the younger brother across the chest and shoulder with enough force to break multiple ribs and dislocate his shoulder. The impact lifted Sean off his feet and threw him backward into a cluster of rocks. His rifle flew from his hands, the bolt still open from his attempt to chamber a second round. Ethan, positioned approximately 10 feet to his brother's right, had a clear shot at the bear as it mauled Sean, but his training in firearm safety prevented him from taking it. The animal was directly on top of his brother, and any shot risked hitting Sean as well as the bear. Instead, Ethan began shouting and advancing toward the bear, hoping to draw its attention away from his wounded brother. The tactic worked, but not in the way Ethan had hoped. The bear, its predatory instincts fully engaged, immediately turned its attention to the second human. Ethan managed to fire one more shot, this one striking the bear in the head, but the bullet glanced off the animal's thick skull rather than penetrating the brain. The impact was enough to enrage the bear further, but not enough to stop it. The bear's attack on Ethan was swift and methodical. The animal used its weight and strength to knock the older brother to the ground, then pinned him with its massive paws while delivering a crushing bite to his neck and head. Brown bears possess one of the strongest bite forces in the animal kingdom, capable of generating over 1,200 pounds per square inch of pressure. Ethan's death was rapid, though not immediate. Sean, severely injured but still conscious, managed to crawl toward his rifle while the bear was focused on his brother. His movements were hampered by his injuries, his right arm essentially useless due to the dislocated shoulder, but desperation gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. He reached his rifle and managed to chamber a round using his left hand, a difficult task under the best of circumstances and nearly impossible with his injuries. His final shot, taken from a prone position at a range of less than 20 feet, struck the bear behind the left ear, penetrating the skull and reaching the brainstem. The massive animal collapsed instantly, its enormous weight falling partially across Ethan's motionless form. Sean's camera, set to continuous shooting mode, captured the final moments of the encounter in a series of images that were later used by investigators to reconstruct the timeline of the attack. The photos, too graphic for public release, showed the reality of a brown bear attack in stark detail. The incredible speed of the animal's movements, the devastating effect of its attacks, and the brothers' desperate but ultimately unsuccessful attempt to defend themselves. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, Sean found himself alone in the Alaskan wilderness with severe injuries, his brother dead, and no immediate means of rescue. His satellite phone had been damaged in the attack, its screen cracked and non-functional. His GPS unit was intact, but calling for help would require him to reach their base camp, nearly a mile away, where they had left their emergency beacon. The journey back to camp took Sean over 3 hours, his progress hampered by his injuries and the increasingly difficult terrain. He was suffering from multiple broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, severe lacerations on his chest and arms, and the early stages of shock. The temperature was dropping as afternoon gave way to evening, and Sean was inadequately dressed for extended exposure to the elements, having left his heavy winter clothing at camp when they departed for their morning hunt. By the time Sean reached their campsite, hypothermia was beginning to set in. His hands were shaking so severely that he could barely operate the emergency beacon, but he managed to activate the device and transmit a distress signal at 4:23 p.m. on November 22nd. The signal was received by the Rescue Coordination Center in Juneau, Alaska, which immediately began coordinating a search and rescue response. The first challenge facing rescuers was the weather. A storm system moving in from the Gulf of Alaska was bringing high winds, heavy precipitation, and rapidly dropping temperatures to the Kodiak area. Flight conditions were deteriorating rapidly, and there was serious question whether aircraft could safely reach the brothers' location before the storm made flight impossible. Coast Guard helicopter pilot Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, flying an MH-60 Jayhawk rescue helicopter based out of Kodiak Coast Guard Station, made the decision to attempt the rescue despite marginal weather conditions. "We had a narrow window," she later explained to investigators. "The storm was moving in fast, and we knew that if we didn't get in there immediately, we might not be able to reach the victim for days." The helicopter reached the area of Carlock Lake at 5:47 p.m., just as visibility was beginning to deteriorate due to low clouds and blowing snow. Martinez and her crew, including flight mechanic Petty Officer First Class Mike Thompson and rescue swimmer aviation survival technician Second Class Lisa Chen, located Sean's emergency beacon signal and began searching for a suitable landing zone near the campsite. What they found when they reached the campsite would stay with the rescue crew for the rest of their careers. Sean Walker was found semi-conscious inside the brothers' tent, suffering from severe hypothermia in addition to his injuries from the bear attack. His brother's body was still at the attack site, nearly a mile away, with the dead bear lying partially on top of him. "The victim was in bad shape," recalled rescue swimmer Chen. "Severe trauma, advanced hypothermia, and he was going into shock. We had maybe minutes to get him stabilized and evacuated before we lost him entirely." The rescue crew immediately began emergency medical treatment while preparing Sean for evacuation. His injuries were extensive. Multiple broken ribs, collapsed lung, dislocated shoulder, severe lacerations requiring dozens of stitches, and the beginning stages of frostbite on his extremities. The flight back to Kodiak took 23 minutes in increasingly dangerous weather conditions. By the time the helicopter reached Kodiak Airport, snow was falling heavily and winds were gusting to over 40 miles per hour. Sean was immediately transferred to Providence Kodiak Island Medical Center, where emergency room physician Dr. James Peterson began the process of saving his life. He was as close to death as you can get and still be viable for treatment, Dr. Peterson later recalled. Core body temperature was 89 degrees. Blood pressure was critically low from blood loss, and he was showing signs of severe shock. If the rescue had been delayed by another hour, he wouldn't have survived. The medical treatment required to save Sean's life was extensive and complex. Emergency surgery was required to repair his collapsed lung and internal injuries from the bear attack. His broken ribs had caused significant internal bleeding that required immediate attention. The dislocated shoulder was relatively minor compared to his other injuries, but added to the complexity of his treatment. Most challenging was treating the hypothermia, which required gradual rewarming to avoid cardiac complications. Sean remained unconscious for 4 days following the attack, his body fighting to recover from the massive trauma he had endured. When he finally regained consciousness on November 26th, his first words were asking about his brother. Dr. Peterson, who had become the primary physician responsible for Sean's care, had the difficult task of informing him that Ethan had not survived the attack. The psychological trauma of the attack would prove to be as challenging to treat as the physical injuries. Sean experienced survivor's guilt, post-traumatic stress disorder, and depression in the months following the attack. The fact that he had been forced to kill the bear that attacked them added another layer of complexity to his psychological recovery. "I keep thinking about what we could have done differently," he told hospital psychiatrist Dr. Maria Rodriguez during one of their sessions. "If we had taken that first shot, if we had moved to a different campsite, if we had left when we found the tracks around our tent, there were so many opportunities to prevent what happened." The investigation into the attack, led by Alaska State Troopers in cooperation with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, began while Sean was still unconscious in the hospital. The first priority was recovering Ethan's body and examining the scene of the attack. However, the same storm system that had nearly prevented Sean's rescue made it impossible to reach the attack site for 5 days. When investigators finally reached the scene on November 27th, they found a scene that challenged their understanding of brown bear behavior. The bear, a massive male estimated to weigh 1,147 pounds, based on measurements taken at the scene, showed clear evidence of having been shot multiple times. Ballistics analysis of the recovered bullets confirmed that both brothers had managed to wound the animal, but the bear's size and adrenaline had allowed it to continue fighting despite fatal injuries. More puzzling was the evidence suggesting that the bear had been actively hunting the humans, rather than simply reacting defensively to their presence. Track analysis by Alaska Department of Fish and Game tracking specialist Jim Morrison revealed that the bear had made multiple approaches to the brothers' campsite over the course of their stay, each time getting closer and spending more time observing their activities. "This wasn't normal brown bear behavior," Morrison explained in his incident report. "Brown bears are typically wary of humans and will avoid contact when possible. This bear was actively seeking contact, which suggests either an abnormal individual or circumstances that we don't fully understand." Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead wildlife biologist investigating the incident, ordered a complete necropsy of the bear to try to understand what might have caused its unusual behavior. The examination revealed that the bear was in excellent physical condition, well fed, and showed no signs of disease or injury that might have affected its behavior. Tests for rabies and other neurological diseases came back negative. From a biological standpoint, this bear was completely normal, Dr. Chen explained in her final report. There was nothing physically wrong with the animal that would explain its behavior. This appears to have been a case of a large, dominant male brown bear that had learned to view humans as prey rather than as a threat to be avoided. The implications of Dr. Chen's findings were troubling for wildlife managers and the hunting community. If Kodiak brown bears were beginning to view humans as potential prey, it would represent a fundamental shift in the relationship between humans and one of North America's most dangerous predators. The incident prompted a comprehensive review of hunting regulations and safety protocols for Kodiak Island. The recovery of Ethan's body required careful planning due to the dangerous location and the presence of other bears in the area. A team of Alaska State Troopers, fish and game officers, and local guides worked together to secure the scene and remove both Ethan's remains and the dead bear for examination. The process took most of a day and required multiple helicopter flights due to weight limitations. Ethan Walker's autopsy, conducted by Alaska State Medical Examiner Dr. Robert Kim, revealed the full extent of the bear's attack. The cause of death was determined to be massive trauma to the head and neck, with the bear's bite having crushed cervical vertebrae and caused fatal damage to major blood vessels. The attack had been swift and decisive, consistent with the hunting behavior of a large predator rather than the defensive actions of a threatened animal. The injuries are consistent with a predatory attack, Dr. Kim noted in his autopsy report. The bear targeted vital areas with precision and delivered crushing bites that would have quickly incapacitated the victim. This was not a mauling in the traditional sense, but rather a methodical killing. The investigation also examined the brothers' equipment and preparations to determine whether any deficiencies in their gear or planning had contributed to the tragedy. The analysis revealed that their equipment was appropriate for the conditions and that their rifles and ammunition were suitable for brown bear hunting. Their camping and hunting techniques were consistent with accepted practices for dangerous game hunting. From an equipment and preparation standpoint, the Walker brothers did everything right, concluded the investigative report. They had appropriate rifles, proper ammunition, quality camping gear, and had researched their hunting area extensively. The tragedy appears to have resulted from encountering an abnormally aggressive individual bear under circumstances that made a successful defense extremely difficult. The legal aspects of the incident were relatively straightforward. Both brothers held valid hunting licenses and brown bear tags issued through the Alaska Department of Fish and Game Lottery System. They were hunting in a legal area during the open season and were in compliance with all applicable regulations. Sean's killing of the bear was clearly justified as self-defense and defense of his brother. However, the incident did prompt discussion about whether unguided brown bear hunting should continue to be permitted on Kodiak Island. Guide Marcus Thompson, who had initially recommended against the brothers hunting without professional assistance, became a vocal advocate for requiring guides for all brown bear hunts on the island. This wouldn't have happened if they had been with an experienced guide, Thompson argued in testimony before the Alaska Board of Game. A guide would have recognized the signs of an aggressive bear and would have gotten them out of there before the attack occurred. These bears are just too dangerous for inexperienced hunters to handle alone. The debate over guided versus unguided hunting continued for months after the attack, with valid arguments on both sides. Proponents of unguided hunting argued that properly prepared and equipped hunters should have the right to hunt independently, and that requiring guides would make brown bear hunting prohibitively expensive for most hunters. Opponents pointed to the Walker brothers' tragedy as evidence that the risks of unguided brown bear hunting were simply too high to justify. Ultimately, the Alaska Board of Game decided not to mandate guides for brown bear hunting, but did implement additional safety requirements, including mandatory bear safety education for all brown bear hunters and enhanced emergency communication requirements for hunters in remote areas. The media coverage of the Walker brothers tragedy was extensive, with the story being covered by major news outlets across the United States and internationally. The dramatic nature of the attack, combined with the unusual behavior of the bear, captured public attention and sparked discussions about wildlife management, hunting safety, and the risks of adventure tourism. Sean's recovery became a focal point of much of the media coverage. His courage in surviving the attack, killing the bear, and making his way back to camp despite severe injuries made him a compelling figure for journalists and television producers. However, Sean largely declined media requests, preferring to focus on his physical and psychological recovery. The physical recovery process was lengthy and challenging. Sean required multiple surgeries to repair the damage from the bear attack and physical therapy to regain full use of his injured arm and shoulder. The psychological recovery was even more difficult, requiring ongoing counseling to deal with the trauma of the attack and the loss of his brother. The hardest part isn't the physical injuries, Sean explained to his psychiatrist 6 months after the attack. It's the knowledge that Ethan died because of a decision we made together. We chose to continue hunting instead of leaving when we found those tracks. That choice cost my brother his life. Sean's guilt was compounded by well-meaning friends and family members who repeatedly told him that he had done everything he could, that there was nothing more he could have done to save his brother. While intended to comfort, these reassurances often had the opposite effect, forcing Sean to relive the details of the attack and question his decisions even more intensely. The financial impact of the attack was also significant. Sean's medical bills exceeded $200,000, only partially covered by insurance. He was unable to work as a photographer for 8 months while recovering from his injuries, resulting in substantial lost income. The hunting trip itself had cost over $15,000, representing a significant financial investment that obviously produced no positive return. Legal action was considered, but ultimately rejected. There was no clear party at fault for the attack other than the bear itself. The charter pilot had fulfilled his contractual obligations safely and professionally. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game had issued proper permits and provided appropriate warning about the dangers of brown bear hunting. The attack appeared to be simply a case of extraordinarily bad luck, combined with an unusually aggressive individual bear. The long-term impact of the Walker brothers' tragedy extended far beyond Sean's personal recovery. The incident became a case study in wildlife management programs, hunting safety courses, and bear behavior research. Dr. Sarah Chen used data from the incident in her ongoing research into brown bear behavior, contributing to a better understanding of the factors that can lead to predatory attacks on humans. Guide services on Kodiak Island reported a significant increase in business following the attack, as hunters who had previously planned unguided hunts decided to hire professional guides instead. A lot of guys who thought they could handle it on their own realized that maybe they needed some help after all, explained guide Marcus Thompson. It's unfortunate that it took a tragedy like this to make people understand the risks. The incident also led to improvements in emergency communication systems for remote areas of Alaska. The Alaska Rescue Coordination Center began requiring more robust emergency communication plans for hunters venturing into areas like Kodiak Island, including backup communication systems and more detailed emergency contact procedures. For the broader hunting community, the Walker brothers' tragedy served as a sobering reminder of the risks inherent in hunting dangerous game. While fatal hunting accidents are relatively rare, the consequences can be devastating when they occur. The incident reinforced the importance of careful preparation, proper equipment, and conservative decision-making when hunting animals capable of killing humans. Sean eventually returned to photography, though he never again hunted brown bears. His experience on Kodiak Island fundamentally changed his relationship with wildlife, shifting his focus from hunting to pure photography and conservation work. He became involved with several wildlife conservation organizations, using his story to promote better understanding of bear behavior and habitat conservation. "I learned that there's a difference between being confident and being reckless," Sean reflected 2 years after the attack. "Ethan and I were experienced hunters, but we weren't experienced with animals like that Kodiak bear. We underestimated what we were dealing with, and it cost my brother his life. I can't change what happened, but I can try to make sure other people learn from our mistake." The bear that killed Ethan Walker and nearly killed Sean was preserved by taxidermists and is now on display at the Alaska Department of Fish and Game office in Kodiak, serving as an educational tool for hunters and visitors. A plaque beneath the mount tells the story of the attack and serves as a reminder of the power and danger of Kodiak brown bears. The final chapter of the Walker brothers' story was written not in the wilderness of Kodiak Island, but in the quiet offices of attorneys and insurance adjusters. The practical aftermath of any tragedy involves paperwork, settlements, and the mundane details of putting lives back together. For Sean, this meant dealing with medical bills, insurance claims, and the legal complexities of his brother's estate. Ethan had been unmarried with no children, making Sean his primary heir. However, the process of settling the estate was complicated by the circumstances of his death and the location where it occurred. Alaska law required extensive documentation of the incident, including testimony from Sean about the circumstances of his brother's death. Each retelling of the story was a fresh trauma, forcing Sean to relive the worst moments of his life in clinical detail. The brothers' employer, the Montana Department of Transportation, provided death benefits and support for Sean's recovery, but the process of obtaining these benefits required additional documentation and testimony. Workers' compensation initially denied Sean's claim for his injuries, arguing that the hunting trip was not work-related, requiring legal action to obtain coverage for his medical expenses. Perhaps most difficultly, Sean had to make decisions about what to do with his brother's possessions, including the hunting equipment they had shared and Ethan's personal effects that had been recovered from the campsite. Some items, including their rifles, had been damaged in the attack and were of no practical value. Others, like Ethan's hunting journals and photographs, held enormous sentimental value but were painful reminders of the tragedy. Sean ultimately donated much of the hunting equipment to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game for use in their hunter education programs, feeling that Ethan would have approved of using their gear to help educate other hunters about bear safety. The rifles, after being repaired, were sold to help cover medical expenses, a practical decision that nonetheless felt like a betrayal of his brother's memory. The investigation into the attack was officially closed 14 months after the incident, with the final report concluding that the deaths were accidental and that no criminal charges were warranted. The report made several recommendations for improving hunter safety in bear country, including enhanced education requirements and improved emergency communication protocols. Dr. Sarah Chen's research into the incident continued long after the official investigation was closed. Her analysis of the bear's behavior patterns, combined with similar incidents from other parts of Alaska and Canada, contributed to a better understanding of the factors that can lead to predatory attacks by brown bears. Her work suggested that such attacks, while extremely rare, were more likely to occur when bears had limited natural food sources. when they were preparing for winter denning, and when they encountered humans in their core territory rather than on the periphery of their range. The Walker brothers were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, Dr. Chen concluded in her published analysis of the incident. They encountered an individual bear that had made the decision to treat humans as prey, a decision that appears to have been based on the bear's individual characteristics rather than any external factors. Such incidents are essentially unpreventable through normal safety precautions and represent the inherent risk of entering the territory of large predators. The long-term psychological impact of the attack on Sean continued to manifest in unexpected ways years after the incident. He developed a phobia of enclosed spaces, apparently related to the experience of being trapped in the tent during the initial moments of the attack. He also struggled with sleep disorders, frequently awakened by nightmares featuring the sounds and sights of the attack. Professional counseling helped Sean develop coping mechanisms for dealing with these symptoms, but the psychological scars of the incident would never fully heal. "You learn to live with it," he explained to a support group for trauma survivors. "The memories don't go away, but you can learn to manage them. Some days are better than others." Sean's photography work evolved to reflect his changed perspective on wildlife and human nature relationships. His post-attack portfolio focused heavily on conservation themes, using his artistic skills to document the beauty of wild places while emphasizing the importance of respecting the dangerous realities of nature. His work gained recognition in conservation circles, with several of his photographs being used in educational materials about wildlife safety. 5 years after the attack, Sean married Jennifer Collins, a trauma counselor he met during his recovery process. Jennifer's understanding of trauma and recovery dynamics helped Sean continue his healing process and provided him with the emotional support necessary to rebuild his life. Their relationship, born from tragedy, became a source of hope and renewal for Sean. The couple settled in Bozeman, Montana, not far from where Sean and Ethan had grown up. Sean established a successful wildlife photography business, specializing in conservation photography and educational materials for outdoor recreationalists. His unique perspective as someone who had survived a predator attack gave his safety education work particular credibility and impact. The memorial service for Ethan Walker, held 6 months after his death, drew attendees from across the hunting and outdoor recreation community. Fellow hunters, wildlife biologists, rescue personnel, and family members gathered to remember a man whose life had been cut short by his passion for the outdoors. The service featured readings from Ethan's hunting journals, his precise observations about wildlife and wilderness serving as a tribute to his methodical approach to life. Sean's eulogy for his brother focused not on the circumstances of his death, but on the life he had lived and the passion for the outdoors that had defined him. "Ethan died doing what he loved," Sean told the gathered mourners. "He would want to be remembered not as a victim, but as someone who lived his life fully and pursued his passions without compromise. The wilderness that took his life was also what gave his life meaning." The Alaska Department of Fish and Game established the Ethan Walker Memorial Fund, dedicated to improving hunter safety education and supporting research into human-bear interactions. The fund, supported by donations from the hunting community and matching funds from the state, has provided grants for bear safety research, hunter education programs, and equipment improvements for search and rescue operations. The impact of the Walker brothers' tragedy on Kodiak Island hunting practices was measurable and lasting. In the 5 years following the attack, the percentage of brown bear hunters using guide services increased from approximately 60% to over 80%. While this change couldn't be attributed entirely to the Walker incident, guides and outfitters reported that many hunters specifically cited the brothers' story when booking guided hunts. People realize that there's a difference between being tough and being prepared, explained guide Marcus Thompson. The Walker boys were tough, experienced hunters, but they weren't prepared for what they encountered. Having a guide isn't about being soft. It's about having someone with experience who can help you make better decisions. The incident also led to improvements in emergency communication technology for remote areas. Satellite communication devices became more sophisticated and more affordable in the years following the attack, making it easier for hunters and other wilderness users to maintain contact with rescue services. The Alaska Rescue Coordination Center reported significant improvements in response times for wilderness emergencies, partly attributed to better communication technology. Dr. Sarah Chen's research into brown bear behavior, enhanced by data from the Walker incident, contributed to international understanding of predator-human interactions. Her work was cited in wildlife management policies across North America and influenced bear safety protocols in national parks and wilderness areas. The specific behavioral patterns observed in the bear that attacked the Walker brothers helped wildlife managers identify warning signs that might indicate when a bear was shifting from normal behavior to predatory behavior. The scientific value of the Walker incident, while coming at a terrible human cost, provided insights that may help prevent similar tragedies in the future. The detailed documentation of the attack, including Sean's photographs and the physical evidence from the scene, created the most complete record of a predatory brown bear attack ever assembled. This documentation became a valuable resource for bear researchers, wildlife managers, and safety educators. 10 years after the attack, Sean Walker published a book about his experience titled Kodiak Nightmare: A Brother's Journey Through Tragedy and Recovery. The book, written with the assistance of outdoor journalist David McKay, provided a detailed account of the hunting trip, the attack, and Sean's recovery process. Proceeds from the book were donated to wildlife conservation organizations and trauma recovery programs. The book's publication generated renewed media interest in the Walker brothers' story, but Sean approached the publicity with careful consideration for the impact on his own recovery and his family's privacy. He agreed to a limited number of interviews and speaking engagements, using these opportunities to educate people about bear safety and the importance of mental health support for trauma survivors. "I'm not writing this book to relive the nightmare," Sean explained in his author's note. "I'm writing it because I hope our story can help other people make better decisions in the wilderness, and can show other trauma survivors that recovery is possible, even from the worst experiences." The Alaska Department of Fish and Game continues to monitor bear behavior on Kodiak Island, looking for signs of other individuals that might pose similar risks to humans. While no bears with behavior patterns similar to the one that attacked the Walker brothers have been identified, wildlife managers remain vigilant for any changes in bear-human interactions that might indicate a shift toward more aggressive behavior. The Walker brothers' campsite at Carlock Lake has become an unofficial memorial site, with subsequent hunters occasionally leaving small remembrances at the location where the brothers established their final camp. While the Alaska Department of Fish and Game doesn't officially recognize the site as a memorial, they have not discouraged the practice, viewing it as a way for the hunting community to remember the brothers and reflect on the risks inherent in their shared passion. The investigation into the attack revealed that the bear had been in the area for several weeks before the brothers arrived, with other hunters reporting sightings of an unusually large bear in the region. However, none of these earlier encounters had suggested that the bear posed an unusual threat to humans. The bear had been observed feeding normally, showing typical wariness of human presence and generally behaving within normal parameters for a large male brown bear. What changed the bear's behavior remains a subject of speculation among wildlife biologists. Dr. Chen's analysis suggested several possible factors: the bear's individual personality and genetics, its previous experiences with humans, the availability of natural food sources, and the specific circumstances of its encounters with the Walker brothers. The complex interaction of these factors created a perfect storm of conditions that led to the tragic outcome. We may never fully understand why that particular bear behaved the way it did, Dr. Chen acknowledged in her final report on the incident. Brown bear behavior is complex and influenced by numerous variables that we don't fully understand. What we can say is that the attack was highly unusual and not representative of typical brown bear behavior, even in situations where bears encounter humans in their territory. The rarity of predatory attacks by brown bears, while providing little comfort to Sean Walker, did help put the incident in perspective for the broader hunting community. Statistics show that hunters are far more likely to be injured or killed in vehicle accidents traveling to and from hunting areas than they are to be attacked by the animals they're hunting. However, the dramatic nature of predator attacks and their relative unpredictability make them a persistent source of anxiety for hunters in bear country. The Walker brothers' tragedy became a case study in risk management for outdoor recreationalists. While it's impossible to eliminate all risks from wilderness activities, the incident highlighted the importance of careful planning, appropriate equipment, conservative decision-making, and the value of experience in dangerous situations. The brothers' story serves as a reminder that even experienced outdoorsmen can encounter situations beyond their control or experience level. Sean Walker's recovery journey continues today, more than a decade after the attack. While he has built a successful new life and career, the impact of that November day on Kodiak Island remains a defining experience. He has become an advocate for both wildlife conservation and trauma recovery programs, using his unique perspective to help others facing similar challenges. "I can't change what happened to Ethan," Sean reflects, "but I can honor his memory by using our story to help other people. If our experience helps one hunter make a safer decision in bear country, or helps one trauma survivor realize that recovery is possible, then maybe something positive can come from something so terrible." The Walker brothers' story serves as a powerful reminder of both the beauty and the danger inherent in wild places. Their tragedy illustrates the thin line between adventure and disaster that exists when humans venture into the territory of apex predators. While such encounters are extremely rare, they represent the ultimate risk faced by those who choose to pursue their passion for hunting and outdoor recreation in the most challenging and dangerous environments on Earth. The November 23, 2024 attack that killed Ethan Walker and forever changed his brother's life stands as one of the most thoroughly documented and analyzed predator attacks in North American history. The investigation into the incident, the extensive media coverage, and the long-term impact on hunting practices and safety protocols have made the Walker brothers' names synonymous with both the risks and rewards of pursuing dangerous game in the world's last wild places. In the end, the story of the Walker brothers is not just about a bear attack, but about the complex relationship between humans and the wild world we share with creatures far more powerful than ourselves. It's a story about the choices we make in pursuit of our passions, the unforeseeable consequences of those choices, and the courage required to continue living after experiencing the unthinkable. It serves as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the human spirit's capacity for survival and recovery in the face of overwhelming tragedy. The next stories. September 22, 2025. Polar bear mauls. 8 tourists on Arctic cruise shore excursion. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine ice fields of Svalbard, Norway, as the luxury expedition cruise ship MS Arctic Dawn positioned itself carefully in the crystalline waters of Magdalena Fjorden. Captain Erik Andersen, a weathered Norwegian with 32 years of Arctic navigation experience, studied the meteorological reports on his bridge with the practiced eye of someone who had witnessed the Arctic's mercurial temperament claim too many lives. The forecast showed optimal conditions, winds at 8 knots from the northwest, visibility extending beyond 15 kilometers, and air temperatures holding steady at -12 degrees Celsius. Perfect conditions for what should have been a routine photography excursion on the sea ice. Hannah Marie Schultz adjusted her rifle strap across her shoulder for the third time in 10 minutes, a nervous habit that had developed over her 7 years as a certified polar bear guide in the Svalbard archipelago. At 34, the former marine biologist from Munich had led over 300 successful excursions onto the ice, earning a reputation among expedition cruise operators as one of the most knowledgeable and safety-conscious guides in the region. Her clients consistently praised her encyclopedic knowledge of Arctic wildlife, her ability to position groups for spectacular photography opportunities, and most importantly, her unwavering commitment to safety protocols that had never once been breached during her tenure. Standing beside her on the ship's observation deck, expedition leader Marcus Thornfield reviewed the manifest for the day's shore party. The British photographer, whose work had appeared in National Geographic, BBC Wildlife, and numerous other prestigious publications, had specifically requested this particular group composition after reviewing the passenger roster 3 days earlier. 8 carefully selected guests, each carrying professional-grade camera equipment worth between £15,000 and £40,000, represented what he considered the ideal small group for intimate Arctic wildlife photography. Dr. Helena Braun, a 62-year-old retired professor of zoology from Vienna, meticulously cleaned the lens of her Canon EOS R5 Mark II for the 4th time since breakfast. Her husband of 37 years, Wolfgang, stood patiently beside her, organizing their shared equipment bag with the methodical precision that had characterized his career as a surgical instrument technician. The couple had saved for 8 years to afford this expedition, liquidating a substantial portion of their retirement savings to purchase the specialized Arctic photography equipment that now surrounded them in carefully padded cases. Ingrid and Magnus Eriksson, the Norwegian couple from Bergen, spoke quietly in their native language while reviewing the itinerary. Magnus, a commercial airline pilot with Scandinavian Airlines, had taken his first leave in 18 months specifically for this cruise, while his wife Ingrid, a pediatric nurse, had coordinated her vacation time to coincide with their 25th wedding anniversary. Their teenage son Christopher had gifted them matching Nikon Z9 cameras for the occasion, joking that his parents needed a hobby that would keep them busy during his final years before university. 28-year-old Alessandro Moretti stood apart from the group, his expensive Italian leather jacket providing an incongruous splash of urban sophistication against the stark Arctic backdrop. The Milan-based fashion photographer had joined the expedition on assignment for Vogue Italia, documenting what the magazine's editors had described as luxury adventure travel for the environmentally conscious elite. His assistant, Maria Santos, a 25-year-old photography student from Barcelona, nervously checked and rechecked their equipment manifest, acutely aware that any lost or damaged gear would likely end her career before it had properly begun. James Mitchell, the 71-year-old retired BBC wildlife cinematographer from Cornwall, moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose arthritis had begun to limit his mobility, but whose passion for capturing nature's most dramatic moments remained undiminished. His wife Patricia had passed away 2 years earlier, and this expedition represented his first major travel since her funeral. Their adult children had initially opposed the trip, concerned about their father traveling alone to such a remote and potentially dangerous location, but had eventually relented when they realized his profound need to reconnect with the natural world that had defined his professional life. Hannah gathered the group around her on the deck, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as she began the final safety briefing that she had delivered hundreds of times before. Ladies and gentlemen, in approximately 20 minutes, we will be departing the ship via Zodiac boats for what should be a spectacular morning on the sea ice. The conditions today are absolutely perfect for photography, with excellent visibility and stable ice conditions that will allow us to get quite close to some truly magnificent ice formations. She paused, making eye contact with each passenger individually. However, I must stress once again the critical importance of following all safety protocols without exception. We are entering the domain of the Arctic's apex predator, and while polar bear encounters are relatively rare, they can occur with absolutely no warning. When I give an instruction, it must be followed immediately and without question. Your life and the lives of your fellow passengers may depend on your instant compliance. Dr. Braun raised her hand. Hannah, you mentioned yesterday that polar bears are most active during certain times of day. Should we be particularly vigilant this morning? Polar bears are actually active around the clock, Hannah replied, but they do tend to be more mobile during the early morning hours when they're hunting for seals. The sea ice conditions we'll be walking on today are ideal for seal breathing holes, which naturally attracts bears to the area. However, our lookouts have been scanning the ice for over an hour, and we've seen no signs of bear activity in our intended photography zone. Marcus stepped forward, his professional camera already hanging from his neck. The light conditions in about 30 minutes will be absolutely perfect for the type of dramatic ice photography that brought us all here. The sun will be at approximately 15 degrees above the horizon, providing that golden Arctic light that's so prized by wildlife photographers. Captain Anderson's voice crackled over the ship's intercom system. Attention passengers and crew preparing for shore excursion. Weather conditions remain optimal, with sustained winds at 6 knots and visibility remaining excellent. Sea ice conditions have been assessed as stable for walking, with ice thickness measurements indicating safety margins well above minimum requirements. Zodiac departure will commence in 15 minutes. Alessandro adjusted his expensive camera strap and turned to Maria. Remember, we need to capture the pristine quality of this environment. The magazine specifically requested images that convey both the beauty and the inherent danger of Arctic travel. They want readers to feel like they're experiencing something genuinely wild and untamed. Maria nodded, though Hannah noticed the young woman's hands shaking slightly as she checked her camera settings. "Are you feeling all right?" Hannah asked quietly, moving closer to the assistant. "Just a bit nervous," Maria admitted. "I've never been anywhere this remote before. In Barcelona, the most dangerous wildlife we encounter are the pigeons in the city squares." Hannah smiled reassuringly. "That's a perfectly normal reaction. The Arctic can feel overwhelming at first, but I promise you're in excellent hands. Just stay close to the group, follow instructions immediately, and you'll have an experience you'll remember for the rest of your life." The Zodiac boats were lowered into the dark water with mechanical precision, their reinforced hulls designed specifically for Arctic conditions. The ship's crew, led by Chief Mate Olsen, conducted final equipment checks, while Hannah performed her ritual inspection of the emergency flare gun, satellite phone, and first aid equipment that never left her side during shore excursions. "The ice conditions look absolutely perfect," observed Magnus, peering over the ship's rail at the pristine white expanse that stretched toward the horizon. "I can see several interesting ice formations that should provide excellent photographic opportunities." Ingrid squeezed her husband's hand. 25 years of marriage, and you still get excited like a schoolboy when you see something beautiful to photograph. Dr. Braun carefully descended the ship's ladder into the first Zodiac, her husband Wolfgang following close behind. Despite her 62 years, the former professor moved with surprising agility, her decades of fieldwork having maintained both her physical fitness and her comfort in challenging outdoor environments. James Mitchell paused at the top of the ladder, his weathered hands gripping the rails more tightly than he had 2 years earlier. The BBC veteran had covered conflicts in Somalia, documented endangered species in the Amazon rainforest, and filmed wildlife in Antarctica. But age had begun to rob him of the effortless confidence that had once characterized his movement through dangerous environments. "Take your time, James," Hannah called up from the Zodiac. "There's no rush whatsoever." The morning air was crisp and clear as the 2 Zodiac boats moved slowly through the dark Arctic water toward the ice edge. The sound of their motors was the only noise in a landscape so pristine and silent that several passengers later reported feeling as though they had entered a cathedral made of ice and sky. Alessandro raised his camera and began shooting immediately, capturing the contrast between the expedition members' brightly colored Arctic gear and the monochromatic landscape surrounding them. "This is exactly what the magazine wanted," he called to Maria over the sound of the motor. "The sense of human vulnerability in an environment that's both beautiful and potentially deadly." The Zodiac boats reached the ice edge without incident, and the crew quickly established a secure beaching point where passengers could safely disembark. Hannah was the first onto the ice, rifle in hand, systematically scanning the surrounding area through high-powered binoculars, while the ship's lookouts maintained their watch from the MS Arctic Dawn. "All clear," she announced. "Ice conditions are excellent, and I'm seeing no signs of wildlife activity in our immediate area." The passengers disembarked with varying degrees of confidence. Dr. Brown and Wolfgang moved with the practiced efficiency of experienced travelers, while Maria Santos required assistance from one of the crew members to navigate the transition from boat to ice while carrying her photographic equipment. Marcus immediately began assessing the photographic opportunities, his professional eye identifying compositions that would showcase both the pristine Arctic environment and the small group of humans moving through it. "The light is absolutely perfect," he announced. "We should be able to get some truly spectacular shots this morning." Hannah established the group's position approximately 100 meters from the ice edge, close enough to the water to capture dramatic shots of ice formations against the dark sea, but far enough inland to provide adequate warning time should any wildlife approach from the ocean. She positioned herself upwind from the group, maintaining clear sight lines in all directions while the passengers arranged themselves for photography. The morning progressed exactly as planned. Dr. Brown captured several stunning images of ice crystals catching the early morning light, while Wolfgang documented the group's activities with the methodical approach that had characterized his professional life. Magnus and Ingrid worked together, with Magnus focusing on wide landscape shots, while his wife concentrated on detailed close-ups of ice formations. Alessandro and Maria moved systematically through their shot list, the experienced fashion photographer directing his assistant to capture both traditional Arctic landscape images and more artistic compositions that would satisfy Vogue Italia's editorial requirements. James Mitchell worked alone, his decades of experience allowing him to anticipate and capture moments that the other photographers missed entirely. At 9:47 a.m., exactly 1 hour and 12 minutes after the group had departed the MS Arctic Dawn, Hannah detected movement in her peripheral vision. The polar bear had approached from downwind, moving across the ice with the silent efficiency that made these predators the most dangerous animals in the Arctic. Adult male polar bears can weigh up to 800 kilograms and move across ice at speeds exceeding 40 kilometers per hour. But this particular bear had been stalking the group for an unknown period of time, using ice formations and wind direction to mask both his scent and his approach. Hannah's training took over instantly. "Bear!" she shouted, her voice carrying clearly across the ice. "Everyone, move to the boats now!" The photographers looked up from their cameras in confusion. The sudden shift from peaceful photography session to life-threatening emergency, creating a moment of cognitive dissonance that would later be identified by trauma specialists as a critical factor in the attack's severity. Dr. Brown, positioned furthest from the ice edge, began moving toward the Zodiac boats with Wolfgang close behind her. The retired professor's field experience had taught her to respond immediately to guide instructions, but her 62-year-old legs struggled to gain traction on the slippery ice surface. Alessandro looked around wildly, momentarily unable to locate the bear that had triggered Hannah's warning. "Where is it?" he called out, his expensive camera equipment forgotten as survival instincts began to override professional obligations. The polar bear emerged from behind an ice formation approximately 50 meters from the group's position, moving with the fluid, purposeful gait that indicated a predator who had already committed to an attack. Hannah raised her rifle, simultaneously activating the emergency beacon that would alert the ship's crew to the developing crisis. James Mitchell, drawing on decades of experience filming dangerous wildlife, immediately recognized the bear's body language as indicating imminent attack behavior. "Move now!" he shouted to the group, his BBC training overriding any concern for personal safety as he began shepherding the younger photographers toward the boats. The bear's charge began without warning, moving at approximately 35 kilometers per hour across the ice. The massive predator closed the distance to the group in seconds. Hannah fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to deter the attack, but the bear's commitment was absolute. Ingrid Eriksson stumbled on the slippery ice surface as she attempted to run toward the Zodiac boats, her camera equipment tangling around her legs and causing her to fall heavily onto the ice. Magnus immediately turned back to assist his wife, abandoning his own escape route in an act of courage that would later be recounted in news reports around the world. Hannah fired directly at the charging bear, her shot striking the animal in the shoulder but failing to stop its momentum. Polar bears possess thick layers of fat and dense muscle that can absorb tremendous damage without immediately incapacitating the animal. And this particular bear seemed to barely register the impact. Maria Santos reached the Zodiac boats first, her terror providing adrenaline that overcame her earlier nervousness about Arctic conditions. She tumbled into the nearest boat, screaming for the crew members to start the engines and prepare for immediate departure. Dr. Brown was 15 meters from the boats when the bear reached Hannah Schultz. The attack happened with brutal efficiency. Hannah had time to fire one additional shot before the bear reached her position, but the angle was poor, and the bullet merely grazed the animal's thick fur. The bear's initial swipe with its massive paw struck Hannah in the chest, with enough force to lift her off the ice and send her flying nearly 3 meters through the air. She landed heavily on her back, the impact driving the air from her lungs and causing her rifle to skitter across the ice, well beyond her reach. The bear was on her in seconds, its massive jaws clamping down on her left arm just below the shoulder. The sound of her bones breaking was audible to the other group members, a sharp crack that cut through the Arctic air like a gunshot. Wolfgang Brown had helped his wife into the Zodiac boat and was turning to assist other group members when he witnessed Hannah's initial injuries. The surgical technician's medical training allowed him to immediately assess the severity of her condition, and he knew that without immediate intervention, the guide would bleed to death within minutes. Alessandro had frozen in terror, his expensive camera still hanging from his neck as he watched the bear maul the woman who had spent the morning ensuring his safety. The fashion photographer's urban background had provided no preparation for witnessing such raw violence, and his mind struggled to process the reality of what was happening just 30 meters away. Magnus Eriksson had succeeded in lifting his wife from the ice and was half carrying, half dragging her toward the boats when the bear's attention turned toward their movement. With Hannah Schultz clearly incapacitated, the predator began scanning for additional targets, its predatory instincts fully engaged. James Mitchell reached into his camera bag and withdrew a marine flare, a piece of safety equipment he had carried during decades of remote wildlife filming. His hands shaking with age and adrenaline, he activated the flare and threw it toward the bear, hoping to distract the animal long enough for the remaining group members to reach the boats. The flare struck the ice near the bear's position, burning with intense red light and acrid smoke. The bear looked up from Hannah's motionless form, momentarily confused by this new element in its environment, providing a few precious seconds for the group's escape attempt. Dr. Brown had reached the Zodiac boat and was screaming for Wolfgang to hurry, her voice breaking with terror and desperation. The retired professor could see that several group members remained on the ice, and she knew that the Zodiac's engines needed time to warm up before the boats could safely navigate away from the ice edge. The bear's attention fixed on Magnus and Ingrid Eriksson, who were still 20 meters from the boats and moving slowly due to Ingrid's fall-related injuries. The predator abandoned Hannah's body and began moving toward the Norwegian couple with the same purposeful stride that had preceded its initial attack. Magnus realized that he and his wife would not reach the boats in time. Making a decision that would haunt his nightmares for years afterward, he pushed Ingrid toward the remaining group members and positioned himself between his wife and the approaching bear. "Run!" he shouted, spreading his arms wide to make himself appear as large as possible. The bear struck Magnus with devastating force, its massive paw connecting with his left side and sending him tumbling across the ice. The impact shattered 3 ribs and caused severe internal bleeding, but Magnus remained conscious and continued shouting for his wife to run. Alessandro finally broke from his paralysis and began running toward the boats, his expensive leather jacket providing no protection against the rough ice surface as he stumbled and fell repeatedly. His camera equipment bounced painfully against his body, but survival instincts had completely overridden any professional concerns. The Zodiac boat engines finally roared to life, their sound carrying clearly across the ice and reaching the crew members still aboard the MS Arctic Dawn. Captain Anderson immediately ordered full emergency protocols, activating the ship's medical facilities and radioing for helicopter evacuation assistance from the nearest Norwegian rescue station. James Mitchell reached the boats and immediately began helping other passengers aboard, his BBC experience having taught him to remain functional under extreme stress. He could see that Hannah Schultz was no longer moving and that Magnus Eriksson was bleeding heavily onto the ice, creating dark red stains that stood out starkly against the pristine white surface. Ingrid Eriksson had fallen again, her injuries from the initial stumble preventing her from maintaining the running pace necessary to reach the boat safely. She crawled across the ice, her hands becoming bloody as she struggled for purchase on the rough surface, while behind her the bear continued to maul her husband. Dr. Braun was screaming medical instructions from the Zodiac boat, her zoology background providing some relevant knowledge about trauma treatment. "We need to stop the bleeding," she shouted to the crew members. "Get the first aid kit and prepare for major trauma injuries." Maria Santos was hyperventilating in the bottom of the Zodiac boat, her camera equipment scattered around her as she struggled to process what she had witnessed. The young photography student's hands were shaking so violently that she could not operate her camera to document the rescue attempt, though the tragic irony of this failure would not occur to her until days later. The bear had inflicted severe injuries on Magnus Eriksson, but had not delivered a killing bite. Instead, the predator seemed to be treating the human as it would a seal, attempting to drag its prey away from the other group members before feeding. This behavior provided crucial additional seconds for the rescue attempt. Wolfgang Braun had joined James Mitchell in helping passengers into the Zodiac boats, the 2 older men working with desperate efficiency to get everyone off the ice before the bear's attention turned toward the group at the water's edge. Both men realized that the Zodiac boats remained vulnerable while passengers were boarding, and that the bear could easily reach their position before the boats could safely depart. Alessandro tumbled into the nearest Zodiac boat, his expensive camera equipment now damaged beyond repair, but his life intact. The fashion photographer immediately began vomiting from a combination of terror, adrenaline, and the realization of how close he had come to sharing Hannah Schultz's fate. Ingrid Eriksson was still 15 meters from the boats when the bear finished with her husband and began moving in her direction. The pediatric nurse could see Magnus lying motionless on the ice, surrounded by an expanding pool of blood, and she knew that her own chances of survival were rapidly diminishing. James Mitchell made a decision that would define the remaining years of his life. Grabbing the emergency flare gun from the Zodiac boat's safety kit, he jumped back onto the ice and began running toward Ingrid's position, shouting and waving his arms to attract the bear's attention away from the injured woman. The BBC veteran's sacrifice provided the distraction necessary for Wolfgang and Dr. Braun to pull Ingrid into the Zodiac boat, though she was screaming her husband's name and attempting to return to the ice, despite her injuries. The retired professor had to physically restrain her colleague's wife to prevent her from jumping back into the water. The bear's attention turned toward James Mitchell, who was now positioned between the Predator and the Zodiac boats. At 71 years old, the retired cinematographer knew he could not outrun the massive animal, but his decades of experience filming dangerous wildlife had taught him that confrontation was sometimes more effective than flight. He fired the flare gun directly at the bear, the projectile striking the animal in the face and burning its fur with intense heat and chemical smoke. The bear reared back on its hind legs, temporarily blinded and disoriented by the flare's impact, providing precious seconds for the Zodiac boats to begin their departure from the ice edge. The crew members had both Zodiac boat engines at full power, the vessels moving away from the ice edge as rapidly as safety conditions permitted. However, they could not abandon James Mitchell, who was now alone on the ice with an enraged polar bear, and Wolfgang Braun was shouting for the boats to return for another rescue attempt. Captain Anderson's voice crackled over the emergency radio frequency. "Zodiac boats, this is Arctic Dawn. We have helicopter rescue inbound, estimated arrival in 12 minutes. Can you maintain safe distance and provide visual confirmation of casualties?" Marcus Thornfield, the expedition leader, responded from the lead Zodiac boat. "Arctic Dawn, we have confirmed casualties on the ice. Hannah Schultz appears to be deceased. Magnus Eriksson is severely injured and unconscious. James Mitchell is stranded on the ice with the bear. We are maintaining position at safe distance pending helicopter arrival." The bear had recovered from the flare gun impact and was moving toward James Mitchell with renewed aggression. The elderly cinematographer had exhausted his immediate options for self-defense and was backing slowly toward the ice edge, hoping to delay the inevitable long enough for rescue to arrive. Dr. Braun was providing medical assistance to Ingrid Eriksson, whose injuries from falling on the ice were complicated by severe shock and hypothermia. The retired professor's hands were steady despite the traumatic circumstances, her decades of scientific training allowing her to function effectively during the crisis. Alessandro continued vomiting in the bottom of his Zodiac boat, the fashion photographer's urban background having provided no preparation for witnessing multiple mauling attacks. Maria Santos was attempting to comfort her employer, though her own psychological state was rapidly deteriorating as the full implications of their situation became clear. The helicopter appeared on the horizon exactly 11 minutes after Captain Anderson's radio call, its distinctive sound carrying clearly across the Arctic landscape. The Norwegian rescue crew had launched from Longyearbyen within minutes of receiving the emergency beacon signal, their response time representing one of the fastest Arctic rescue operations in the region's history. James Mitchell could hear the approaching helicopter, but the bear was now less than 10 meters away and moving with the deliberate pace of a predator who had cornered its prey. The BBC veteran raised his arms above his head and began shouting at the top of his lungs, hoping to appear larger and more threatening than his 71-year-old frame naturally suggested. The helicopter's arrival changed the dynamics of the situation immediately. The pilot brought the aircraft low over the ice, the rotor wash creating a windstorm that disoriented the bear and provided covering noise for the rescue operation. 2 paramedics rappelled from the helicopter onto the ice, carrying high-powered tranquilizer equipment and emergency medical supplies. The first paramedic, Sergeant Lars Blomberg of the Norwegian Air Rescue Service, had 23 years of Arctic rescue experience and had participated in dozens of polar bear encounters. He immediately assessed the situation and fired a tranquilizer dart at the bear from a distance of approximately 25 meters. The tranquilizer took effect within 90 seconds, causing the bear to become increasingly disoriented and eventually collapse onto the ice in a sedated stupor. James Mitchell was evacuated to the helicopter immediately, suffering from severe shock and mild hypothermia, but no physical injuries. The second paramedic, Corporal Emma Nilsson, began emergency treatment of Magnus Eriksson, whose injuries included 3 broken ribs, severe lacerations on his left arm and torso, and significant blood loss. She established an IV line and began administering emergency medications while her partner prepared Hannah Schultz for transport. Hannah Schultz was pronounced dead at the scene, her injuries from the initial bear attack having been fatal within minutes. The polar bear guide, who had led over 300 successful expeditions, had died doing exactly what she had trained for 7 years to do, protecting her clients from Arctic wildlife. The helicopter evacuation required 2 trips to transport all casualties and survivors back to Longyearbyen, where emergency medical facilities had been prepared for major trauma treatment. Magnus Eriksson was stabilized during the flight and subsequently airlifted to University Hospital North Norway in Tromsø for specialized surgery. The Zodiac boats returned to the MS Arctic Dawn without incident, though several passengers required immediate medical attention for shock, hypothermia, and minor injuries sustained during the evacuation from the ice. Captain Anderson ordered the ship to return immediately to Longyearbyen, cutting short the expedition and activating comprehensive passenger support protocols. Alessandro and Maria were treated for shock and released within hours, though both would require extensive psychological counseling to process their trauma. The fashion photographer's assignment for Vogue Italia was cancelled indefinitely, and he would not return to professional photography for over 8 months. Dr. Helena Braun and Wolfgang required overnight observation for shock and exposure-related injuries, though both recovered fully within days. The retired professor's quick thinking and medical knowledge during the crisis had likely saved Ingrid Eriksson's life, and she would later be commended by Norwegian authorities for her actions during the emergency. Ingrid Eriksson spent 3 days in Longyearbyen Hospital before being cleared for medical evacuation to Bergen, where she would undergo months of physical therapy for her ice-related injuries and psychological counseling for post-traumatic stress disorder. Her husband Magnus spent 6 weeks in intensive care in Tromsø before being transferred to a rehabilitation facility. James Mitchell became an international media figure overnight, with his decision to sacrifice himself to save Ingrid Eriksson being featured in newspapers and television broadcasts around the world. The elderly cinematographer deflected praise for his actions, insisting that any member of the group would have done the same thing under similar circumstances. The investigation into the attack began within hours of the rescue operation, with Norwegian authorities working in coordination with international wildlife experts to determine the circumstances that had led to the unprecedented aggression displayed by the polar bear. Preliminary findings suggested that the bear was an adult male in good physical condition, with no obvious signs of disease or starvation that might explain its behavior. Dr. Astrid Fugelsteg, the leading polar bear researcher from the Norwegian Polar Institute, arrived in Longyearbyen within 24 hours to begin a comprehensive investigation of the attack site. Her initial assessment revealed that the bear had likely been attracted to the area by seal activity around breathing holes in the ice, and that the photography group had inadvertently positioned themselves between the predator and its intended hunting ground. The sedated bear was transported to a remote location and released after extensive veterinary examination revealed no abnormalities that would explain its aggressive behavior toward humans. However, the animal was fitted with a tracking collar to monitor its movements and prevent future interactions with human activities in the region. Media coverage of the attack was immediate and extensive, with international news organizations sending correspondents to Svalbard within days of the incident. The story was covered by CNN, BBC World Service, German television networks and newspapers throughout Europe, with particular attention focused on Hannah Schultz's death and James Mitchell's heroic actions. The cruise industry responded to the attack by implementing enhanced safety protocols for Arctic expeditions, including mandatory dual guide requirements for all shore excursions in polar bear territory and upgraded emergency communication equipment for all vessels operating in Svalbard waters. Alessandro's damaged camera equipment was eventually recovered from the attack site, though most of the devices were beyond repair due to impact damage and exposure to Arctic conditions. The estimated value of destroyed photography equipment exceeded €2 million, making it one of the most expensive wildlife encounters in modern expedition cruise history. The psychological impact of the attack on survivors was severe and long-lasting. Dr. Brown required 6 months of counseling before she could resume travel, while Wolfgang developed a permanent fear of wilderness environments that effectively ended their shared hobby of nature photography. Alessandro and Maria both left the photography industry, with Alessandro eventually becoming an art gallery curator in Milan, and Maria returning to university to study psychology. Ingrid Eriksson's recovery was complicated by survivor guilt and post-traumatic stress disorder related to witnessing her husband's near-fatal injuries. She required 2 years of intensive therapy before she could return to her work as a pediatric nurse, and the couple eventually divorced after 27 years of marriage, with both citing the psychological aftermath of the attack as an insurmountable barrier to their relationship. Magnus Eriksson's physical recovery took 14 months and included multiple surgeries to repair damage to his ribs, arm, and internal organs. His airline pilot career ended due to medical restrictions related to his injuries, and he eventually became an advocate for improved safety protocols in Arctic tourism. James Mitchell's story became the subject of a documentary film produced by the BBC titled Arctic Hero: The James Mitchell Story. The retired cinematographer used his newfound fame to advocate for wildlife conservation and improved safety measures for expedition tourism, though he never returned to the Arctic after the attack. The legal proceedings following the attack were complex and extended over several years. Hannah Schultz's family filed wrongful death lawsuits against both the cruise line and the expedition tour operator, alleging that inadequate safety measures had contributed to their daughter's death. The cases were eventually settled out of court for undisclosed amounts. The insurance claims related to the attack exceeded €12 million, including medical expenses, equipment replacement, legal settlements, and business interruption costs for the cruise operator. The incident prompted a comprehensive review of insurance coverage requirements for Arctic expedition tourism throughout the industry. Environmental groups used the attack to highlight the increasing conflicts between human tourism and Arctic wildlife, arguing that climate change and shrinking sea ice were forcing polar bears into more frequent contact with human activities. Several organizations called for restrictions on tourist access to prime polar bear habitat, though these proposals were opposed by the tourism industry. The attack occurred during a period of unprecedented tourist interest in Arctic destinations, with expedition cruise bookings reaching record levels despite the obvious risks involved. Industry analysts noted that the Svalbard attack actually increased interest in polar bear viewing expeditions, as travelers sought what they perceived as more authentic and dangerous wildlife experiences. Norwegian authorities implemented new regulations for Arctic tour operators following the attack, including mandatory bear safety training for all guides, required emergency communication equipment for shore parties, and enhanced medical evacuation insurance for all passengers. These measures were subsequently adopted by other Arctic nations, including Canada and Greenland. The polar bear involved in the attack was monitored continuously for 2 years following the incident, with researchers tracking its movements and behavior patterns through satellite collar technology. The animal showed no subsequent aggressive behavior toward humans and was eventually determined to have acted within normal predatory parameters given the circumstances of the encounter. Hannah Schultz was posthumously awarded the Norwegian government's highest civilian honor for courage in the face of danger, recognizing her sacrifice in protecting her clients during the bear attack. Her funeral in Munich was attended by hundreds of mourners, including expedition guides from around the world who had worked with her during her 7-year career. A memorial scholarship was established in Hannah's name at the University of Munich's biology department, providing funding for students interested in pursuing careers in Arctic wildlife research and conservation. The scholarship has supported dozens of graduate students since its establishment, with several recipients going on to become prominent polar bear researchers. The attack site on the sea ice near Magdalenfjorden was designated as a restricted area for tourism activities for 5 years following the incident, though this designation was eventually lifted after extensive wildlife monitoring showed no unusual bear activity in the region. However, tour operators voluntarily avoided the area for several additional years out of respect for the victims and their families. Alessandro's partially completed assignment for Vogue Italia was eventually published as a memorial tribute to Hannah Schultz, with all proceeds from the magazine's sales donated to Arctic wildlife conservation organizations. The images, captured moments before the attack, provided a haunting contrast between the serene beauty of the Arctic environment and the violent reality of wilderness survival. The MS Arctic Dawn was retired from service 18 months after the attack, with the cruise line citing passenger booking difficulties and crew recruitment problems related to the vessel's association with the tragedy. The ship was eventually sold to a cargo company and converted for commercial freight service in less sensitive Arctic routes. Captain Eric Anderson took early retirement following the attack, his 32-year career ending with the traumatic memory of coordinating the rescue operation while watching his crew's shore party being mauled by a polar bear. He eventually became an instructor at the Norwegian Maritime Academy, training future Arctic navigators in emergency response protocols. The investigation's final report, published 14 months after the attack, concluded that the incident was an unfortunate but unavoidable consequence of human activity in polar bear habitat during peak hunting season. The report recommended enhanced safety protocols but found no negligence on the part of the tour operators or guides involved in the excursion. Dr. Fugelsteg's research team used the attack as a case study for understanding polar bear behavior under stress conditions, publishing several scientific papers that advanced the global understanding of human-wildlife conflict in Arctic environments. The research contributed to improved safety protocols for Arctic researchers and tourists throughout the circumpolar North. The tranquilizer equipment used during the rescue operation was upgraded and standardized across all Norwegian rescue services, with the successful sedation of the attacking bear serving as proof of concept for similar emergency interventions. The protocols developed during the Svalbard rescue have since been used in dozens of polar bear emergencies throughout the Arctic. 3 years after the attack, Ingrid and Magnus Eriksson returned to Svalbard for a private memorial ceremony honoring Hannah Schultz, marking the first time either had returned to the Arctic since the traumatic incident. Their visit was coordinated with Norwegian authorities and conducted under heavy security, but both reported that the ceremony provided important psychological closure. James Mitchell continued to be celebrated as a hero, though he consistently deflected praise and maintained that his actions were simply the result of decades of training in dangerous environments. He donated most of the proceeds from his documentary film to Arctic wildlife conservation organizations and continued to advocate for improved safety measures until his death from natural causes in 2031. The camera equipment recovered from the attack site was eventually repaired and donated to the Norwegian Polar Institute, where it continues to be used for wildlife research and documentation. Some of the images captured during the final moments before the attack have become important historical documents of human polar bear interaction. The cruise industry's response to the Svalbard attack included the development of comprehensive bear safety training programs for all expedition staff, mandatory backup guide requirements for Arctic shore excursions, and enhanced emergency communication systems for all vessels operating in polar bear habitat. These measures were credited with preventing similar tragedies during subsequent expedition seasons. 5 years after the attack, a memorial plaque was installed at Longyearbyens Visitor Center, commemorating Hannah Schultz's sacrifice and serving as a reminder to future Arctic travelers of the inherent risks involved in wilderness tourism. The plaque includes safety reminders and contact information for emergency services throughout the Svalbard archipelago. The psychological trauma experienced by attack survivors led to the development of specialized counseling programs for expedition tourism casualties, with treatment protocols specifically designed for individuals who had witnessed wildlife attacks in remote locations. These programs have since been used to treat survivors of similar incidents throughout the world. Alessandro eventually returned to photography as a fine art practitioner, creating gallery installations that explored themes of human vulnerability and nature's indifferent power. His work was heavily influenced by his experiences during the polar bear attack, though he never again worked as a travel or wildlife photographer. Maria Santos completed her psychology degree and specialized in trauma counseling, eventually establishing a practice that focused specifically on helping adventure tourism casualties process their experiences. Her personal understanding of wildlife attack trauma made her particularly effective in treating similar cases throughout her career. Dr. Brown and Wolfgang eventually resumed travel, though they never again participated in wildlife viewing expeditions. Their experience during the polar bear attack led them to become advocates for enhanced medical training requirements for expedition tour operators, arguing that basic trauma treatment knowledge should be mandatory for all guides working in remote locations. The bear population around Svalbard continued to be monitored intensively following the attack, with researchers noting increased vigilance among tour operators and guides when working in areas known to support polar bear activity. The enhanced awareness likely prevented several potential human-bear conflicts during subsequent expedition seasons. 10 years after the attack, Norwegian authorities published a comprehensive review of Arctic tourism safety protocols, using the Svalbard incident as a primary case study for developing improved emergency response procedures. The review's recommendations were adopted by Arctic nations throughout the circumpolar north and significantly enhanced tourist safety in polar bear habitat. The legacy of September 22, 2025 extended far beyond the immediate casualties and survivors, fundamentally changing how the international tourism industry approached wildlife viewing in dangerous environments. The attack served as a watershed moment that forced operators, governments and travelers to confront the genuine risks inherent in seeking authentic wilderness experiences in an increasingly developed and commercialized world. Hannah Schultz's death became a symbol of the dedication and sacrifice required to safely guide tourists through some of the world's most dangerous environments, while James Mitchell's heroism demonstrated the extraordinary courage that ordinary people can display when facing life-threatening situations. Together, their stories from that tragic morning on the Svalbard ice continue to influence Arctic tourism policies and inspire discussions about the appropriate balance between adventure travel and personal safety. The attack also highlighted the complex relationship between climate change, wildlife behavior, and human activity in the Arctic, contributing to ongoing debates about sustainable tourism in environments under increasing environmental pressure. As sea ice continues to diminish and polar bear habitat becomes more constrained, the lessons learned from the September 22nd attack remain relevant for anyone seeking to experience the Arctic's magnificent but unforgiving wilderness. The families of all those involved in the attack continue to be affected by the events of that morning, with some finding meaning through advocacy and memorialization, while others chose privacy and quiet healing. Regardless of their individual paths, all survivors carry the memory of those few terrifying minutes when the pristine Arctic environment revealed its capacity for sudden, devastating violence against those who venture into its domain, inadequately prepared for the reality of truly wild places. The story of the polar bear attack near Magdalenfjorden serves as both a tribute to those who lost their lives or suffered injuries while pursuing their passion for Arctic wilderness, and a sobering reminder that nature's beauty and nature's danger are often inseparable companions in the world's most remote and magnificent places. Nachi Epilogue. 10 years later. 10 years after the tragedy, the Arctic tourism industry had been fundamentally transformed by the lessons learned from that September morning. The comprehensive safety protocols developed in response to Hannah Schultz's death and the heroic actions of James Mitchell had become the global standard for expedition cruising in polar bear territory. Dr. Astrid Fuglesteg, now director of the Norwegian Polar Institute, published her landmark study on human polar bear interactions in 2035, dedicating the work to Hannah's memory. The research, based partly on data collected from the attacking bear's tracking collar, revealed crucial insights into predator behavior that had prevented numerous subsequent conflicts. Magnus Eriksson, permanently disabled but alive thanks to the quick actions of his rescuers, established the Arctic Safety Foundation with insurance settlement funds, providing equipment and training to expedition guides throughout the polar regions. His organization had trained over 2,000 guides by 2035, creating a network of safety professionals whose expertise stretched from Svalbard to the Canadian Arctic. The Memorial Scholarship in Hannah's name had supported 47 graduate students by its 10th anniversary, with 12 recipients becoming professional polar bear researchers and wildlife guides. The program's success ensured that Hannah's commitment to safety and Arctic conservation would continue influencing future generations of wildlife professionals. Alessandro's art installations, displayed in galleries across Europe, brought the reality of Arctic wildlife encounters to urban audiences who would never experience such environments firsthand. His work served as both memorial to the attack's victims and educational tool for understanding the genuine risks faced by those who chose to venture into the world's last wild places. The polar bear that attacked the photography group lived until 2033, when it died naturally at an estimated age of 28 years. Research data collected throughout its life provided unprecedented insights into polar bear behavior, contributing to conservation efforts that helped stabilize the Svalbard population despite ongoing climate pressures. The MS Arctic Dawn's sister ship, redesigned with enhanced safety features inspired by lessons learned from the attack, continued operating Arctic expeditions with a perfect safety record. The vessel carried a memorial plaque honoring Hannah Schultz in its bridge, ensuring that every expedition began with a reminder of the courage required to safely guide tourists through polar bear country. James Mitchell's documentary had been viewed by over 50 million people worldwide by 2035, inspiring countless individuals to pursue careers in wildlife conservation and Arctic research. The film's educational impact extended far beyond entertainment, serving as a training tool for expedition guides and a sobering reminder of the split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death in the world's most unforgiving environments. The attack's influence on Arctic tourism safety protocols had prevented an estimated 37 potential polar bear encounters by 2035, according to industry safety analysts. The comprehensive guide training programs, enhanced emergency equipment requirements, and improved evacuation procedures developed in response to the Svalbard tragedy had created the safest period in Arctic expedition tourism history. Maria Santos, now a leading trauma counselor specializing in adventure tourism casualties, had treated over 300 clients affected by wildlife encounters, extreme weather events, and other expedition-related traumas. Her practice, informed by her personal experience during the polar bear attack, provided crucial support services that helped survivors process their experiences and return to meaningful lives. The Eriksson family's story became a symbol of resilience in the face of unimaginable tragedy, with Ingrid's eventual return to nursing and Magnus's advocacy work demonstrating the human capacity to find purpose and meaning even after experiencing profound trauma. Their divorce, while painful, allowed both to pursue healing paths that honored their different ways of processing the attack's aftermath. Dr. Brown and Wolfgang's advocacy for enhanced medical training among expedition guides resulted in mandatory first aid certification for all Arctic tour operators by 2030. Their efforts, born from witnessing Hannah's fatal injuries and Magnus's near-death experience, ensured that future expedition guides would be better equipped to provide life-saving medical intervention during wildlife emergencies. The attack site itself had returned to its natural state, with no permanent markers of the tragedy that had unfolded there. The ice where Hannah Schultz died and Magnus Eriksson nearly lost his life appeared identical to thousands of other pristine Arctic locations, a reminder of nature's indifference to human suffering and the temporary nature of human presence in the world's most remote places. Captain Anderson's students at the Norwegian Maritime Academy learned emergency response protocols that incorporated lessons from the September 22nd attack, ensuring that future Arctic navigators would be better prepared to coordinate complex rescue operations in polar bear territory. His teaching, informed by the traumatic experience of managing the crisis from the ship's bridge, provided practical knowledge that could not be learned from textbooks alone. The attack's 10th anniversary was marked by a private ceremony in Longyearbyen, attended by survivors, family members, and members of the Norwegian rescue services who had participated in the emergency response. The gathering served as both memorial to Hannah Schultz and celebration of the safety improvements that had emerged from the tragedy. The story of September 22, 2025 remained a defining moment in Arctic tourism history, demonstrating both the awesome power of polar wilderness and the extraordinary courage that ordinary people could display when confronted with life-threatening circumstances. The attack's legacy lived on through improved safety protocols, enhanced guide training, and the memorial scholarship that continued Hannah's work of safely introducing people to the Arctic's magnificent but dangerous beauty. As expedition cruise ships continued to navigate the waters around Svalbard, their passengers remained largely unaware of the tragedy that had fundamentally transformed their safety. The comprehensive protocols protecting them, the enhanced training of their guides, and the sophisticated emergency equipment aboard their vessels all traced their origins to those terrifying minutes when a polar bear's ancient hunting instincts collided with modern tourism in the pristine wilderness of the Arctic Ocean. The attack served as a permanent reminder that despite humanity's technological advances and safety innovations, the natural world retained the power to humble and devastate those who ventured into its domain. For the survivors, their families, and the thousands of professionals whose work was influenced by the tragedy, September 22nd, 2025, would forever represent both the ultimate price of seeking authentic wilderness experiences and the extraordinary heroism that such encounters could inspire in ordinary people faced with impossible choices. Hannah Schultz's sacrifice, James Mitchell's courage, and Magnus Eriksson's survival had created a legacy that extended far beyond their individual stories, influencing Arctic safety protocols that would protect countless future travelers venturing into the magnificent and unforgiving wilderness of the polar regions. Their story remained a testament to both human vulnerability in the face of nature's power and the extraordinary courage that could emerge when ordinary people were called upon to make extraordinary sacrifices for others. The next stories. The Barrens. The Barrens. Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her binoculars against the frost-covered window of the research station, watching the early morning light paint the vast Canadian tundra in shades of amber and gold. 3 weeks into their Arctic ecology research expedition, and she still found herself mesmerized by the raw, unforgiving beauty of the barren grounds. The landscape stretched endlessly before them, a rolling expanse of permafrost, scattered lakes, and hardy vegetation that had learned to thrive in one of Earth's harshest environments. "Coffee's ready," called Marcus Rivera from the small kitchenette behind her. The marine biologist had volunteered to take morning cooking duties, a gesture that had earned him considerable goodwill from the research team. At 34, Marcus was the oldest member of their group, and his steady presence had become an anchor for the younger researchers during their isolation in the remote Northwest Territories. Sarah lowered her binoculars and turned to accept the steaming mug. "Any sign of our friends from yesterday?" she asked, referring to the small herd of caribou they'd been tracking as part of their migration study. "Elena's been monitoring the GPS collars since 5 this morning," Marcus replied, nodding toward the bank of electronic equipment where Dr. Elena Vasquez sat, hunched over her laptop. The wildlife ecologist had barely slept, consumed by the data streaming in from their tagged animals. She thinks they've moved southeast toward 30 Mile Lake. The fourth member of their team, James Wu, emerged from his sleeping quarters looking considerably less enthusiastic about the early start. The glaciologist had spent the previous day collecting ice core samples from a series of small lakes, and his back was paying the price. At 28, he was the most recent addition to Dr. Chen's research team, having completed his doctorate just 18 months earlier. "Please tell me we're not hiking another 15 kilometers today," James groaned, stretching his arms above his head. "My vertebrae are staging a revolt." Sarah smiled sympathetically. She understood the physical toll their work was taking on everyone. They were stationed 90 kilometers northwest of Baker Lake, Nunavut, completely cut off from civilization except for their satellite communication equipment and the float plane that would return for them in 10 days. The isolation was part of what made their research site so valuable. They could observe Arctic ecosystems without human interference, but it also meant that every decision carried additional weight. There was no backup plan, no easy way out if something went wrong. Actually, I was thinking we might establish a secondary observation post closer to the lake, Sarah said, spreading a topographical map across the small dining table. If Elena's right about the herd movement, we'll want to be positioned to observe their crossing behavior. Elena looked up from her laptop, her dark eyes bright with excitement despite the early hour. The data's pretty clear. They're following the traditional route along the Esker system. If we can get to the elevated position here, she pointed to a spot on the map about 8 kilometers southeast of their current location. We'll have perfect sight lines across the crossing point. Marcus studied the route Elena had indicated. The terrain was typical for the region, relatively flat with occasional rocky outcroppings and small lakes. But the 8-kilometer trek would take them further from their base station than they'd ventured before. "What's the backup plan if weather moves in?" he asked. "That front from yesterday could circle back." "There's a small emergency shelter marked on the survey maps," Sarah replied, pointing to a location roughly halfway between their current position and Elena's proposed observation point. "It's probably just a basic cabin, but it would provide emergency shelter if needed." James nodded slowly, still working the kinks out of his shoulders. "I suppose I could use the walk, and there might be some interesting permafrost formations along that route." His professional interest was beginning to override his physical discomfort, a transformation Sarah had witnessed many times in dedicated researchers when interesting data was at stake. They spent the next hour planning their expedition, checking equipment, and preparing for the day ahead. Sarah felt the familiar mixture of excitement and responsibility that came with leading a research team in remote conditions. Each of her team members was brilliant in their respective fields, but she was the one who had to balance their scientific objectives against the practical realities of survival in the Arctic. By 8:30, they were ready to depart. Each team member carried a backpack loaded with scientific equipment, emergency supplies, and enough food and water for a full day in the field. Sarah had insisted on redundant communication devices. Each person carried both a satellite phone and an emergency beacon, a precaution that had seemed excessive when they were planning the expedition, but now felt entirely reasonable. The morning was crisp and clear, with temperatures hovering around -5°C, practically balmy for late September in the Arctic. They moved single file across the tundra, following caribou trails that had been worn into the permafrost by countless generations of migrating animals. Sarah took point, using a GPS unit to navigate while Marcus brought up the rear, periodically checking behind them to ensure they maintained their bearing back to base camp. The walking was easier than expected. The permafrost provided solid footing, and the caribou trails offered the most efficient routes across the landscape. Elena frequently stopped to take photographs and notes, documenting the vegetation changes as they moved southeast toward higher ground. James collected soil samples at regular intervals, carefully labeling and storing them in his pack. "Look at this," Elena called out during one of their rest breaks, pointing to a series of depressions in the ground near a small pond. Fresh tracks, probably from yesterday evening or early this morning. Sarah and Marcus approached to examine Elena's discovery. The tracks were unmistakably large, round, and featured distinct claw marks. Polar bear. "Adult male, I'd guess," Elena continued, kneeling beside the clearest print. "See the width here? And the claw spacing? This is a big animal." Marcus felt a familiar tightening in his chest. During his years of marine research, he'd encountered polar bears on several occasions, usually from the safety of a research vessel. But here on the tundra, the dynamic was entirely different. "How fresh would you estimate?" Elena studied the tracks more carefully, examining how the edges had been affected by wind and the slight temperature variations between night and day. 6 to 8 hours, maybe. The definition is still sharp, but there's been some settling from the overnight frost. James looked around nervously. "So it could still be in the area?" Polar bears can cover enormous distances, Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice calm and informative. It could be 30 kilometers away by now, or it could be just over that ridge. That's why we follow protocols. She pulled out her satellite phone and called back to their base station, recording a detailed message about their location, the bear sign, and their planned route. It was a precaution that might seem excessive, but Sarah had learned during her years in the field that the difference between a successful expedition and a disaster often came down to maintaining rigorous safety procedures, even when everything appeared to be going well. They continued southeast, but the mood of the group had shifted subtly. Everyone was more alert, scanning the horizon more frequently, and their conversations had taken on a more subdued tone. Sarah knew this was natural. The presence of a large predator demanded respect and heightened awareness, but she also wanted to ensure that reasonable caution didn't escalate into paralyzing fear. "Elena, tell us about polar bear behavior," she said as they resumed walking. "What should we expect if we encounter this individual?" Elena seemed grateful for the opportunity to share her expertise, and Sarah could see her colleagues relaxing slightly as Elena shifted into her teaching mode. "Well, polar bears are incredibly intelligent and curious animals," she began. "Unlike grizzlies or black bears, they don't have an instinctive fear of humans. We're not part of their evolutionary experience, so they approach us with the same investigative behavior they'd use for any other potential food source." "That's comforting," James muttered. "Actually, it is," Elena continued. "It means their behavior is predictable if you understand what drives them. This time of year, before the sea ice forms, they're in a state called walking hibernation. They're conserving energy, moving slowly, not actively hunting. A healthy adult male will typically avoid confrontation unless he's protecting food or feels cornered." Marcus adjusted his pack straps, considering Elena's explanation. "So our best strategy is to give it plenty of space and avoid surprising it." "Exactly. Make noise, stay together, and if we do encounter it, make ourselves appear as large and non-threatening as possible. Back away slowly, speak in calm voices, and whatever we do, don't run. Running triggers their chase instinct." The educational discussion helped the group settle into a comfortable rhythm again. They made good time across the relatively flat terrain, stopping occasionally to photograph interesting geological features or to collect samples. By mid-morning, they had reached the elevated position Elena had identified on the topographical maps. The view from their new vantage point was spectacular. 30-mile lake stretched out below them, its dark waters reflecting the morning sky like polished obsidian. The caribou herd was visible in the distance, perhaps 3 kilometers away, moving steadily along the shoreline in the characteristic single-file pattern that had been perfected over millennia of Arctic survival. "Perfect," Elena breathed, immediately beginning to set up her spotting scope and camera equipment. "This is exactly what we needed." Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction as she watched her team members deploy their instruments and begin collecting data. This was why they endured the cold, the isolation, and the risks. Moments when everything came together, and they could observe natural processes that few humans had ever witnessed. James had found an outcropping of exposed permafrost nearby and was already collecting samples, carefully documenting the soil stratification with his camera. Marcus was using GPS equipment to precisely map their position and establish reference points for Elena's behavioral observations. Everyone was in their element, focused and productive. They worked steadily through the late morning and early afternoon, documenting the caribou movement patterns, collecting geological samples, and photographing the remarkable landscape around them. Sarah found herself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of field research. the careful balance between scientific observation and simple appreciation for the remarkable environment they were privileged to study. Around 2 o'clock, Eleanor announced a significant development. "They're preparing to cross," she said, her eye pressed to the spotting scope. "The lead animals are testing the shoreline, and I can see the rest of the herd beginning to bunch up behind them." This was the behavior they had traveled hundreds of kilometers to observe. Sarah gathered the team around Elena's scope, and each researcher took turns watching as the lead caribou carefully entered the lake, testing the depth and bottom conditions before committing to the crossing. "Incredible," Marcus whispered. "Look how the others wait for the signal from the leaders." The crossing took nearly an hour to complete. Sarah found herself completely absorbed in the spectacle, hundreds of caribou moving across the dark water in a steady stream, their antlers creating a forest of movement against the vast Arctic sky. This was scientific observation at its most profound level, the kind of experience that reminded her why she had devoted her career to understanding the natural world. It wasn't until Elena began packing away her equipment that Sarah noticed the change in weather conditions. While they had been focused on the caribou crossing, a bank of heavy clouds had moved in from the northwest, and the wind had picked up considerably. "We should start back," she announced, checking her watch. "I want to be within sight of base camp before this weather deteriorates further." The return journey began under increasingly ominous skies. The temperature had dropped several degrees, and occasional snow flurries began to reduce visibility. Sarah maintained a steady pace, following their GPS track back toward the research station. But she found herself glancing frequently at the darkening sky with growing concern. They were approximately 4 kilometers from base camp when Elena made the discovery that changed everything. "Sarah," she called out, her voice tight with controlled alarm, "you need to see this." Elena was kneeling beside another series of tracks, but these were different from the ones they had observed that morning, fresher, and moving in the same direction they were traveling. "How fresh?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Very fresh, maybe 30 minutes, maybe less." Elena's professional composure couldn't quite mask the worry in her voice. "And Sarah, it's following our trail." Marcus joined them at the track site, examining the evidence with the careful attention of someone who had spent years observing animal behavior in marine environments. "These prints are directly on top of our boot prints from this morning," he confirmed. "This animal has been tracking us." James looked around nervously at the increasingly hostile weather conditions. "So what do we do? Speed up? Change course?" Sarah felt the weight of leadership settling heavily on her shoulders. They were still 4 kilometers from safety. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, and they had a large predator that was apparently following their trail. Every decision from this point forward could have life or death consequences. "We stick together and maintain a steady pace back to camp," she decided. "No sudden movements, no panic, but we need to stay alert. Elena, what's your read on this behavior?" Elena was studying the tracks with professional intensity, trying to extract every piece of information the evidence could provide. "This is investigative behavior, curiosity, rather than active hunting. But the fact that it's following our trail suggests high intelligence and persistence. We're dealing with a mature, experienced animal." "How far behind us?" Marcus asked. "Based on the track condition and the weather, maybe 20 or 30 minutes when these were made. Could be closer now." Sarah made a decision that balanced immediate safety against the practical realities of their situation. "We continue toward base camp, but we stay together and maintain constant awareness. If anyone sees the bear, we stop immediately and follow Elena's protocols. No heroics, no individual decisions. We succeed or fail as a team." The next hour tested every member of the research team in ways their academic training had never prepared them for. The weather continued to deteriorate, with increasing wind and snow reducing visibility to less than 100 meters. They moved steadily across the tundra, following their GPS track back toward the research station. But the psychological pressure of knowing they were being followed by a large predator created a tension that was almost unbearable. Elena periodically checked behind them for fresh tracks, confirming that the bear was indeed continuing to follow their trail. The animal seemed to be maintaining a consistent distance, close enough to keep them in sight, but far enough back to avoid direct confrontation. "It's testing us," Eleanor explained during one of their brief stops. "This is classic polar bear behavior when they encounter something unfamiliar. It's gathering information, how we move, how we react, whether we represent a threat or an opportunity." "Opportunity for what?" James asked, though his tone suggested he didn't really want to hear the answer. "Food primarily, but also territory, resources, or just satisfying curiosity. Polar bears are incredibly intelligent, and they investigate anything unusual in their environment." Marcus consulted his GPS unit. 2.5 kilometers to base camp, maybe 45 minutes at our current pace. That's when the weather took a turn for the worse. What had been steady snow flurries suddenly intensified into a full Arctic squall, with driving snow and winds that made forward progress difficult and visibility nearly impossible. Sarah called the team together behind a small rocky outcropping that provided minimal shelter from the wind. "This changes our situation significantly," she said, having to raise her voice to be heard above the howling wind. "We have 3 options. Push through the storm and try to reach base camp, wait here until the weather improves, or head for that emergency shelter we saw on the maps." "How far to the shelter?" Marcus asked. Sarah consulted her GPS unit, squinting at the display through the blowing snow. "About 1 kilometer southeast, but that takes us off our direct route back to camp." Elena was scanning their surroundings, trying to spot any sign of their follower through the reduced visibility. "In weather like this, the bear might seek shelter too, but it also reduces our visibility advantage. And if we stay here, we're exposed to the elements with minimal protection," James added. "This outcropping won't provide much shelter if the storm intensifies." Sarah weighed their options carefully. Push through the storm toward base camp and risk becoming lost or exhausted. Stay in place and risk hypothermia in increasingly dangerous conditions, or detour to the emergency shelter and risk extending their time in the field with a predator nearby. "We head for the shelter," she decided. 1 kilometer is manageable even in these conditions, and a roof over our heads gives us options if we need to wait out the storm. The trek to the emergency shelter was one of the most difficult kilometers Sarah had ever traveled. The wind was relentless, driving snow into their faces and making it nearly impossible to maintain their bearing. She led the team using GPS and compass, stopping frequently to ensure everyone remained together and accounted for. When the small log structure finally appeared through the swirling snow, Sarah felt a surge of relief that was almost overwhelming. The shelter was basic but solid. A traditional Arctic survival cabin with thick walls, a small wood stove, and emergency supplies. More importantly, it represented safety and shelter from both the storm and any wildlife that might be tracking them. Marcus reached the door first and pushed it open, revealing a single room with bunks, a table, and shelves stocked with canned food, matches, and other emergency supplies. "Not exactly luxury accommodations," he said with forced humor, "but it beats freezing to death in a blizzard." They filed into the cabin, grateful to be out of the wind and driving snow. Sarah immediately began inventorying the emergency supplies, while Elena checked the windows and door for security. James started a fire in the small wood stove, and Marcus established communication with their base station using the satellite phone. "Base camp, this is Field Team Alpha," Marcus spoke into the phone. "We've taken shelter at the emergency cabin coordinates. Yes, we're all accounted for and in good condition. Weather forced us off route. Understood. We'll maintain regular contact." He ended the call and looked at his teammates. "I left a detailed message with our situation and location. If we're not back by tomorrow morning, they'll know where to look for us." Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. They were safe, warm, and in communication with base camp. The immediate crisis was over, even if their situation remained challenging. "Elena, any sign of our friend during the trek here?" she asked. Elena shook her head. "Visibility was too poor to see tracks, but my guess is that it sought shelter somewhere too. Polar bears are smart enough to avoid unnecessary exposure to severe weather." They settled in to wait out the storm, establishing watches and organizing their equipment. The cabin was surprisingly comfortable once James got the wood stove producing steady heat, and the emergency supplies would easily sustain them until the weather improved. As darkness began to fall, Sarah found herself reflecting on the day's events. They had accomplished their primary research objectives, observed remarkable wildlife behavior, and successfully navigated a potentially dangerous situation using sound judgment and teamwork. It was exactly the kind of experience that reminded her why she loved field research, despite its inherent risks and challenges. That's when Elena, who was taking the first watch at the window, made the observation that changed everything. "Sarah," she said quietly, "you need to see this." Sarah joined Elena at the window, peering out into the swirling snow and darkness. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the storm continuing to rage across the tundra. Then Elena pointed to a spot roughly 50 meters from the cabin. A large, pale shape was barely visible through the snow, moving slowly but deliberately in their direction. "It followed us," Elena whispered. "Even through the storm, it followed our trail to the shelter." Sarah felt her heart rate spike as the reality of their situation became clear. They weren't just weathered in at an emergency shelter. They were trapped in a small building with a curious and persistent polar bear outside. Marcus and James quickly joined them at the window, and all four researchers watched in fascination and growing alarm as the massive animal approached the cabin. In the dim light filtering through the snow, they could see it was indeed a large male, probably weighing close to 400 kilograms and standing nearly 3 meters tall when upright. "What's it doing?" James whispered. Elena was studying the bear's behavior with professional intensity, even as her pulse raced with the immediate danger they were facing. "It's investigating. Look how it's moving. Slow, deliberate, testing the air. It's gathering information about us and this shelter." The bear circled the cabin slowly, occasionally stopping to examine specific areas. When it reached the door, it spent several minutes investigating the entrance, using its powerful sense of smell to gather information about the humans inside. "Door's solid," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice calm, "and those windows are too small for it to get through." Sarah was thinking tactically, considering their options and resources. "Emergency supplies. What do we have for wildlife encounters?" Elena checked the emergency kit mounted on the wall. Flare gun, air horn, and bear spray. She held up a large canister. "Military-grade deterrent. Enough to drive off a polar bear?" "In theory, yes." But Elena looked genuinely worried as she continued, "Polar bears are different from other species. They're more persistent, more curious, and less likely to be discouraged by deterrents." The bear had completed its circuit of the cabin and now sat down roughly 20 meters away, facing the building directly. It appeared to be settling in to wait. "So, what's our situation?" Sarah asked, gathering her team around the small table to discuss their options. Elena set down the bear spray and looked at each of her colleagues in turn. We have an adult male polar bear that has followed us for several kilometers and is now exhibiting persistent investigative behavior. It's not displaying overt aggression, but it's also not leaving. Marcus consulted his watch. Storm's supposed to clear by tomorrow morning, according to the weather forecast. If we can wait it out... That assumes it loses interest, James interjected. What if it doesn't? What if it's still there when the weather clears? Eleanor considered the question carefully. Polar bears can be incredibly patient. They'll wait at seal breathing holes for hours or even days. Time isn't really a factor in their decision-making. Sarah felt the weight of leadership pressing down on her again. They were safe for the moment, but their situation was far from resolved. What are our realistic options? We could try to scare it off, Eleanor suggested. Use the deterrents we have. Flare gun, air horn, bear spray. Make ourselves seem like more trouble than we're worth. Risk? Marcus asked. If it works, the bear leaves and we can return to base camp tomorrow. If it doesn't work, we might provoke more aggressive behavior. And we'd be using up our only defensive resources. Option 2, Sarah prompted. Wait it out, stay in the shelter, maintain communication with base camp, and hope the bear eventually loses interest and moves on. And if it doesn't, Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then we have a long-term standoff situation. But polar bears don't typically maintain interest in stationary objects for extended periods unless there's a specific attractant. James looked around the small cabin. What kind of attractant? Food? Possibly, but more likely just curiosity about us. We represent something new and potentially interesting in its territory. Sarah made her decision based on the information available and her assessment of the risks. We wait through the night, maintain watches, stay quiet, and see if it moves on naturally. If it's still there in the morning, we reassess our options. They organized a watch schedule, 2 people awake at all times, monitoring the bear's behavior and maintaining communication with base camp. Sarah and Elena took the first watch, while Marcus and James tried to get some rest on the emergency bunks. Through the long Arctic night, they watched the polar bear maintain its vigil outside their shelter. Sometimes it would stand and pace around the perimeter of the cabin, occasionally stopping to investigate specific scents or sounds. Other times, it would simply sit and observe, its intelligent eyes seeming to look directly through the windows at the humans inside. It's remarkable in a way, Elena whispered during her watch shift, to observe this level of complex behavior in a wild predator. This animal is problem-solving, making strategic decisions, demonstrating patience and intelligence that rivals any species on Earth. Sarah nodded, though her appreciation for the bear's intelligence was tempered by her awareness of their vulnerable situation. How long do you think it will maintain interest? Unknown, Elena admitted. I've never seen documented behavior quite like this. Usually, polar bear encounters are brief. Either the bear is deterred and leaves, or it becomes aggressive and attacks. This extended investigative phase is unusual. Marcus and James took over the watch at 2 in the morning, and Sarah tried to rest despite the extraordinary circumstances. She found herself listening to every sound from outside the cabin, every creak of the building settling, every shift in the wind pattern. Sleep came in brief, fitful intervals. When dawn finally arrived, the storm had cleared as predicted, revealing a pristine Arctic morning with crystal-clear air and unlimited visibility. It also revealed that their polar bear companion had not lost interest during the night. The massive animal was now positioned roughly 30 meters from the cabin, lying down but clearly alert and watching their shelter intently. In the bright morning light, its size and power were even more impressive and intimidating than they had appeared during the storm. "Status report," Sarah said, gathering her team around the table for a morning assessment. Eleanor had been observing the bear's behavior since sunrise. No change in basic pattern. It's maintaining distance but constant surveillance. No signs of aggression, but also no indication that it's planning to leave any time soon. Marcus had been in communication with base camp. I've updated our situation report. They're aware of our location and circumstances, and they've initiated preliminary contact with wildlife authorities in Rankin Inlet. Timeline for potential assistance, Sarah asked. If weather holds, a float plane could reach us by late afternoon. But that assumes we can establish a safe landing area and extraction point. James had been studying the topographical maps of their area. There's a lake about 2 kilometers southeast that's marked as suitable for float plane operations. But getting there means traveling through open territory with our friend out there. Sarah considered their options methodically. They could wait for assistance, which might take many hours and would require the bear to eventually lose interest. They could attempt to drive off the bear using their defensive resources, which carried significant risks but might resolve the situation quickly. Or they could attempt to travel to the extraction point while the bear was present, which would require careful planning and considerable courage. Elena, what's your professional assessment of our chances if we attempt to move to the extraction point? Elena had been dreading this question, knowing that her expertise might require her to recommend a course of action that terrified her personally. If we move as a group, make noise, and maintain visual contact with the bear while avoiding direct confrontation, we have a reasonable chance of reaching the lake without incident. Polar bears typically avoid confrontation with groups of humans who appear confident and non-threatening. Typically, Marcus asked. Nothing is certain with wildlife behavior, but this individual has shown curious rather than aggressive behavior for over 12 hours. That suggests it's unlikely to attack unless it feels cornered or threatened. Sarah weighed the options carefully. Waiting for rescue required them to remain trapped in the cabin for an indefinite period while hoping the bear would eventually leave. Attempting to move to the extraction point was risky, but would allow them to take control of their situation. We move as a team to the extraction lake, she decided. Carefully, professionally, but we take control of our situation rather than waiting passively for rescue. They spent the next hour preparing for what would likely be the most dangerous journey of their careers. Elena reviewed polar bear protocols with the entire team, ensuring everyone understood the procedures for group movement in the presence of a large predator. Marcus tested all communication equipment and established check-in procedures with base camp. James organized their essential equipment, leaving behind anything that wasn't absolutely necessary for survival or research documentation. Sarah found herself experiencing a mixture of fear and professional excitement that she had never encountered before. This was field research at its most intense, a situation where scientific knowledge, practical experience, and sound judgment would determine whether they survived or became statistics. "Everyone ready?" she asked, looking around at her colleagues. They formed up at the cabin door in the formation Eleanor had recommended. Sarah in the lead with the GPS and communication equipment, Elena second with the bear spray and defensive materials, Marcus third carrying emergency supplies, and James bringing up the rear with backup communication devices. Sarah opened the cabin door slowly, and they emerged into the crisp Arctic morning air. The polar bear immediately noticed their movement, standing up and orienting toward them with obvious interest, but no immediate signs of aggression. "Remember, no sudden movements. Maintain voice contact and keep visual contact with the bear at all times," Elena said quietly. "If it approaches, we stop moving and make ourselves appear large." They began walking southeast toward the extraction lake, following Elena's protocols exactly. The bear maintained its distance, but clearly followed their movement, sometimes standing upright to get a better view of their progress, sometimes dropping down to all fours to pace parallel to their route. The 2-kilometer journey felt like the longest walk of Sarah's life. Every step required conscious attention to the bear's behavior. Every decision about route and pace had to balance speed against the risk of provoking aggressive behavior. But gradually, Elena's professional assessment proved correct. The bear seemed content to observe their movement without direct confrontation. When the extraction lake finally came into view, Sarah felt a surge of relief that was almost overwhelming. They had successfully traveled through open territory in the presence of a large predator, demonstrating that careful planning and professional expertise could overcome even extremely dangerous situations. Marcus immediately established communication with base camp and the incoming rescue aircraft, while Elena continued monitoring the bear's behavior. The massive animal had stopped at the lake's edge and was watching their activities with obvious interest, but maintained its respectful distance. "Aircraft ETA 40 minutes, Marcus reported. "They want us positioned at the southern end of the lake for pickup." Sarah nodded, feeling the first real confidence she had experienced since their ordeal began. They had made the right decisions, followed proper protocols, and would soon be safely extracted from a situation that could have easily become tragic. The float plane's arrival was one of the most welcome sounds Sarah had ever heard. As the aircraft circled the lake and prepared for landing, she looked back at the polar bear that had dominated their last 24 hours. The magnificent animal was still watching them, probably trying to understand these strange visitors to its territory. "Remarkable experience," Elena said, echoing Sarah's thoughts. "To observe that level of intelligence and persistence in a wild predator, and to successfully navigate the interaction without harm to either species." "Think we'll ever see it again?" James asked. Elena smiled, some of the tension finally leaving her shoulders. "Probably not. But it will remember us, just as we'll remember it. This encounter will become part of its learned experience about humans, just as it's become part of ours about polar bears." The float plane landed smoothly on the dark water of the Arctic lake, and Sarah felt the profound satisfaction that comes with completing a challenging and dangerous field research expedition successfully. They had accomplished their scientific objectives, survived an extended wildlife encounter, and emerged with a deeper understanding of both the natural world and their own capabilities under extreme pressure. As they climbed aboard the rescue aircraft, Sarah took one last look at the polar bear that had provided them with such an extraordinary and terrifying experience. The massive animal was still watching from the shoreline, its intelligent eyes seeming to acknowledge their departure with the same curiosity it had shown throughout their extended encounter. 6 weeks later, back in the comfort of her university office, Sarah was still processing the psychological impact of their Arctic experience. She had written detailed reports of their research findings, presented their data to scientific conferences, and participated in multiple debriefings with wildlife authorities. But the personal impact of facing such a powerful predator in its own environment continued to influence her thoughts and dreams. Elena had thrown herself into analyzing the behavioral data from their encounter, working with polar bear specialists to understand the significance of the extended investigative behavior they had observed. The consensus among experts was that they had witnessed remarkably sophisticated decision-making by a truly exceptional individual animal. Marcus had become something of a celebrity among his marine biology colleagues, speaking at conferences about the psychological and practical challenges of field research in extreme environments. His steady leadership during their crisis had earned him considerable respect and several new research opportunities. James had channeled his experience into his research, focusing on how climate change was affecting Arctic ecosystems and the wildlife that depended on them. His first-hand encounter with a polar bear had given him a personal connection to conservation issues that energized his academic work. But for all of them, the most lasting impact was a deeper appreciation for for the intelligence and majesty of Arctic wildlife, and a profound respect for the psychological challenges of survival research in some of Earth's most demanding environments. They had faced their fears, made life or death decisions under extreme pressure, and emerged with a story that would influence their careers and their understanding of the natural world for the rest of their lives. The polar bear, meanwhile, had returned to its solitary existence on the tundra, carrying with it the memory of 4 curious humans who had visited its territory and provided an interesting diversion during the long wait for sea ice formation. In the vast and unforgiving Arctic, both species had learned something valuable about coexistence, respect, and the complex dance between curiosity and survival that defines life in the wilderness.